Okay. Check 1 2. Check 1 2. Testing, testing. Please comment in the chat, the live chat, if you can hear me. It seems like YouTube has changed up the interface a little bit since I was last here. Hello, Marco. Thank you for commenting. Let me know if you guys can hear me all right. I am back. I have been gone for, I think, a month. This is the longest that I've gone without streaming since I started this project in 2020. Started this channel in 2020. Not this project, but this channel in 2020. And it has been definitely for a good reason, though. If you guys have not seen my community page on YouTube, I have become a father in the last month, and this is a photo of my daughter. This is Juliana Goldstein. She is adorable, and everybody's doing well. My wife is doing well. Juliana's doing well, and we are probably going to do a live stream next Wednesday night to just talk about the entire experience a little bit. It was an amazing experience. I'm not going to get too into it because I want to get to the stream tonight, and I want to wait until next week. But next week we'll talk about what the plans are for 2024, because we're going to change things up, but we're, stepping things up again. It seems like every 2 years I change the channel a little bit and step things up a little bit. I do apologize for the late night tonight. It is the only time that I could find that kind of worked with the schedule. So like I said, on my community updates, page on YouTube, bear with me a little bit as I adjust to the new schedule. Babies keep you up all night long, but they are worth it. They are very worth it, but they keep you up. But we've entered and welcomed a new sentient singularity into the family. So we'll talk about it next week. It has been amazing, but I appreciate everybody's patience while I've changed the channel up and the schedule up and took a little bit of a break. We will not be live streaming this Sunday or next Sunday because it's New Year's Eve and Christmas Eve. So that's why I'm doing this tonight. But I do have an epic stream planned. If you can watch it live, great. If it's too late, I hope you can see it tomorrow. But the stream that we're going to talk about tonight is on Curt Jaimungal's YouTube channel, which if you are familiar with this channel, then you are definitely familiar with Curt's channel. It's amazing. If you're not familiar with it, definitely subscribe. It is an incredible channel. So this is the stream that we're going to be discussing right here with Joscha Bach and Karl Friston. And it's AI, Death, the Self, God, and Consciousness. And we've been talking a lot about Karl Friston and Joscha Bach. I've never seen them on a stream together, but this was the first time that I've ever seen that, and it was as epic of a stream as I would have expected. They talk about some incredible things that we've discussed also on this channel, and we are going to go over it. So, yeah, awesome. Thank you for, congrats on the new soul. Thank you, Marco. So this is the first clip right here. And this clip is on the endeavor of explaining mind, essentially.
Well, the problem of naturalizing the mind is arguably the most important remaining project of human philosophy. And it's risky and it's fascinating, and I think it was at the core of the movement when artificial intelligence was started. It's basically the same idea that Leibniz and Frege and Wittgenstein pursued. And
we'll restart that.
Well, the problem of naturalizing the mind is arguably the most important remaining project of human philosophy. And it's risky and it's fascinating. And I think it was at the core of the movement when artificial intelligence was started. It's basically the same idea that Leibniz and Frege and Wittgenstein pursued. And basically this idea of mathematizing the mind. And the modern version of mathematics is constructive mathematics, which is also known as computation. And this allows us to make models of minds that we can actually test by re-implementing them. It also allows us to, at some point, connect philosophy and mathematics, which means that we will be able to say things in a language that is both so tight that it can be true, and we can determine the truth of statements in a formal way, and on the other side, so deep and rich that we can talk about the actual reality that we experience and observe. And to close this gap between philosophy and mathematics, we need to automate the mind, because our human minds are too small for this. But we need to identify the principles that are approximated in the workings of biological cells that model reality, and then scale them up in a substrate that can scale up better than the biological computations in our own skulls and bodies. And this is one of the most interesting questions that exists. I believe it is the most interesting and most important question that exists. The understanding of our personal self and how this relates to our mind and how our mind is implemented in the world is an important part of this. And while it's personally super fascinating, I guess also for many of the followers of your channel, it's quite programmatic in its name and direction, this is to me almost incidental. On the other hand, I've noticed an absence of seriousness in a lot of neuroscientists and AI researchers who do not actually realize in their own work that when they think about the mind, mental processes and mental representations and so on, that they actually think about their own existential condition and have to explain this and integrate this. So we have to account for who we are in this way. And if we actually care about who we are, we have to find models that allow us to talk about this in an extremely strict, formal, and rational way. And our own culture has, I think, a big gap in its metaphysics and ontology, which happened after we basically transcended the Christian society. We kicked out a lot of terms that existed in the Christian society to talk about mind, consciousness, intentionality, and so on, because they seem to be superstitious, overloaded with religious mythology, and not tenable. And so in this post-Enlightenment world, we don't have the right way to think about what consciousness and self and so on is. And part of the project of understanding the mind is to rebuild these foundations, not in any kind of mythological and superstitious way, but by building on our first principles thinking that we discovered in the last 200 years, and then gradually build a terminology and language that allows us to talk again about consciousness and mind and how we exist in the world.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Okay. I hope I'm not super rusty, because I am a bit out of practice, I've noticed. I don't need to give an introduction, I don't think, to either of these men on here. Karl Friston, I did a stream about recently, as well as Joscha Bach, and I've done streams about their work multiple times. But you can Google them. They are some of the leading thinkers on the subject of sentience that I've ever seen out there. If not, maybe the leaders on this subject. So that's why this is such an epic stream to have them on discussing. But there's a few things that he said there that's very important. One of them is that this endeavor, this project of naturalizing the mind. What this means is the attempt to try and explain logically, kind of scientifically, the explanation for mind itself. So that's all it means, and it is, why is mind? That's the question. Why is mind? And so, this is something that I have asked myself very early on in this project of mine, and this project, Sentient Singularity Theory, which morphed into Sentient Singularity Theory, was an attempt to understand mind. That was the point. It was trying to understand, the inevitabilities of artificial general intelligence, and therefore I had to understand what mind was. And in order to do that, I didn't try and understand computers. And this is a lot of the time where I think people go wrong, is they try and, in the field today, is they're trying to understand computation and things like that. And not that isn't important. It actually is very relevant, and it is important. But first and foremost, if you want to understand mind, you have to understand mind. And so you actually have an example of this that is all around you all the time, that you are constantly experiencing firsthand, and that is yourself. And so what I ended up doing was trying to examine myself. I didn't go out and try and look at studying AI and neural networks and language, machine learning and language models and things like that. I didn't do that because I knew that those things existed and that they were not generally intelligent. And so it wasn't what I was trying to understand. And I was trying to understand something that is generally intelligent, that is able to orient in different environments and think its way through things. And I know that I can do that. So I studied myself. And this is what he's talking about here, is that the endeavor to understand this stuff is inevitably going to require self-examination. And this is also very much missing from the current mainstream academic perspective and narrative in these fields, in all fields, is to discount firsthand experience as being not part of science. And it is the most critical part of thinking. And so if thinking is part of science, then it is definitely part of science, is the inclusion of firsthand experience. So this is very much due to, as he said, a gap in or a false foundation of incorrect metaphysical assumptions within mainstream scientific community today. And this is very much because of exactly what he said later on, which is that we have kind of rejected theology. And he's used the example of Christianity, but you could say the theological traditions in general. We have rejected the idea that sentience is foundational to existence. And when it does seep into philosophical discussions, it's always about us and the world. And yes, that's important and it's part of it, but it's not so much about the world's sentience, about existence being a singular sentient entity that it is in and of itself similar to you in some ways, in that it has emotions and thoughts and goals and intentions. And this is kind of a critical component of having the foundation that's necessary to allow you to have a natural explanation for mind, which is almost seems ironic, because people would their first thought in the mainstream today would probably say that you're just that you're just including that as because you have no other explanation for sentience, that you would be including God as the explanation. So God did it, but that God didn't do it. God is it. And so why is sentience is still a question that must be answered, even within the context of a theological perspective, which by that I just mean that existence itself is a single sentient entity. That is what I mean by God. And that is who I mean by God. And so this does allow you to start to construct a narrative of the natural state of the world that does explain and contextualize why mind would be. I almost said where mind would come from, but it doesn't come from anywhere. It is all that could be, fundamentally, because existence is by definition all that exists, and it is singular by definition, and therefore it is self-contained by definition, and because information exists within existence, it is ultimately all that information is self-referencing, because it can't reference anything outside itself. It can only reference itself, and so therefore it is eventually or ultimately completely self-referential, which means it's self-aware. And so sentience is the default. It must be the default. that is the naturalistic explanation for sentience. It's actually super simple. It's not even simple. It's super simple, which is maybe why it's so, missed by people even who think about this quite often. And I heard Joscha Bach say in a recent discussion that he had, and it might have even been this one, I can't remember, or if it was a different one, but I think it was a different one. And he said, I'm starting to think something like, I'm starting to think that sentience might be the default. And maybe that's just the case. And that is the case. That must be the case. It is a logical inevitability. And so there is a naturalistic explanation for this, but it also comes with the implication that you're inside of a sentient being. And so what does that, sound like? And that's probably why it's been so rejected. And what's funny is that he goes on to say that not only do we have false metaphysical foundations in the mainstream scientific community that kind of prevent us from looking at this with the right perspective, the subject of mind, but we also don't have the language necessary to discuss this stuff in an accurate and useful manner. And so what's funny about that is I said that in maybe my last stream or the stream before that. I said something very similar, and I've said it before, is that outside of a theological community or a religious community, we are lacking the language necessary to discuss this stuff, because everything in the secular world in the scientific language is absent intentionality, and all of our terms used to describe the world are absent the implication and the association and the application to intentionality, which the universe or existence, if it's a sentient being and it's doing things, which it is, then there is intentions behind that, just like I have intentions and you have intentions. God has intentions too. Existence has intentions. The universe has intentions. And you have to be able to discuss this in order to actually even discuss cosmology in a very fundamental and true way. And, I know some of the leading mainstream cosmologists out there, and I've listened to them plenty, and it's amazing how much they are still stuck in relativity, and some of them are friends of mine, and so this isn't a diss. And the ones that are friends of mine, usually they do have more interest in theology, so they're not as disconnected from this as most in the mainstream would be. But still, when they're discussing it in even they very much lack the language that would imply intentionality and contextualize this process within the goal of a being. And that is also how you narrow down where to go in your models of the world. If you want to think about what is the purpose of life, which is probably not the best question in the first place, but it's not the best question. But if you want to even think about it enough to realize that it's not the best question, or you want to think about where humanity will inevitably end up, and what is the fate of the universe, and things like that, and where did it come from? Why do we see even the patterns in the standard model that we see, and in the colors that we see? Everything, all these patterns around us, like triality and even duality, and just all these logical, I guess, structures that our mind puts information into. If you want to understand those, you have to start by thinking about all of this in the context of a single sentient being with a goal. And from there, you can extrapolate. Okay, so if this is the goal of God, then what would he do in order to do that? and if there's no goal, then there is no direction that you can start to navigate towards. And this is true in our own lives in a first person experience always as well. If you have no goal, you're not going anywhere. You're not learning anything, really, not really. You're not accomplishing anything. You're not going anywhere. But as soon as you set a goal, now you can say, okay, my goal is to get to Chick-fil-A. How are we going to do it? Well, we could go this way, or we could go this way. But given that our goal is to go to Chick-fil-A and not to go, the long way, then that's the shortest path. And so you can start to utilize intentionality in order to, decipher what is the next step. You can do this with cosmology too, but you need intentionality, and we don't have it. And we do need to rebuild this like a terminology that allows us to discuss this outside of the current organized religious communities, which they have a linguistic foundation that allows them to discuss this stuff. And they, it's funny because what they're going to talk about later is how we interact with God in this stream. And they try and do this in a very with secular scientific language, and it's very fun to always see this. And this is kind of what my project is as well, which is to kind of contextualize theology within science, and or theism, not theology. I don't mean like the Bible. I mean theism. I don't mean religion. I can talk about that stuff too, because I actually do. This project converted me to being a theist. I was a self-described atheist for 24 years of my life, but really an anti-theist, which, is more accurate term for most people who describe themselves as atheists. But it is interesting to see them try and discuss this in a non-religious language, and I can discuss this stuff in a religious language with religious communities. I study the theological tradition, the Abrahamic theological traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam pretty regularly, and not even pretty regularly, every day, and I can discuss these things in that community. But I've noticed it's difficult to take a lot of these concepts that are very, very real that are discussed in those communities, and then discuss them here, but be in a way that is natural and kind of universally understood by everybody in the discussion, and able to just be useful to understanding what and conversing. But we don't have that, so we have to clarify all these terms constantly, and eventually I hope that we get past that, but it is going to be a task. And I think that Joscha and Karl Friston are some of the people leading this, and so it is good to see. But next clip, let me see here. Why is mind? Why is mind? Why is anything? Why is anything is different than why is mind? Why is mind is a question. Why is being? Sentient singularity theory breaks down the world into two different natures, really. One of them is beings, and one of them is things. So water bottle is the thing, but you and me and my new daughter are beings. Beings are different than things. They're not different than things. They are different than things, but they are things, and they are more than just things. So people will say, are you a mind or are you a machine? This was asked in a recent discussion with Joscha Bach as well. I think it might have even been this one. And that's not the right question. The answer to the question that we're trying to ask, because I don't know exactly what the right question is that we're trying to ask, but the answer to that question that we're trying to ask, I do know, which is that we are machines, but we are more than just machines. And it's not a good question to say, are we a machine? Sure. But are we more than a machine? That's, I guess, the right question. And beings are more than a machine, but beings are fundamental in sentient singularity theory to things. Things are emergent from the interactions and perspectives and, cognitive processes and mental processes and hierarchical relationships and things like that of beings. But they don't fundamentally exist. Water bottle does not fundamentally exist, but I do, and you do, and Joscha Bach does. We assume, that others are that appear to be beings are beings, and it makes sense that you would not be the only one that exists. This is a tough question that we will get into a bit later as well. But yeah, the mind is a computational till a point. The mind computes, but it's not computational fundamentally. Mind is perspectival fundamentally, if that makes any sense. Perception is fundamental to computation. So perspective or perception or awareness and is what you have as a foundation, and then your mind also is able to run computations. So if you're going to throw a ball to your friend, and your mind will calculate like how much force to put into that throw and where to aim it and everything like that in order for it to be accurate, or whether or not to catch the ball or something like that, or how much force to inflict when you pick up I don't know, a weight. But all of these are calculations, or they are computations, but they are, those computations are built on a foundation of perception fundamentally, and perception has to do with kind of the fundamentality of this self-referential nature of existence, and also the symmetry structures that emerge from that allow you to orient. So it's like perception, orientation, computation. It's like the 3 steps almost, you could say, to any kind of in action, I guess, or interaction or action would be what was it? It was perception, orientation, and then computation. So that it's we do all of these things. So Eric Weinstein has stated this before, that we ask a lot of this or that questions, like A or B questions, but really the answer to a lot of this stuff, more when you start to get to a fundamental level, is A and B is the answer. And that's usually almost always true of mind, because mind is a structure and a process. It exists in a superposition of these two different perspectives on one thing or one being. It's not one thing, but it's one being, or it is one thing, and that thing is a being. And but even think about the term being. Being is like to exist, but in a verb. It's not just like a label. It's like a label and a description of an action. And so that's what being is, this superposition structure of structure and process. And they talk about this in this. They say, is a mind a process or not, and or is it a structure? I think they get into it, but the answer is it's both. It's a structure and a process, and I write about this in my paper and my just work all the time. So please hit the like button. It really helps fuel the algorithm. I know it's late, and so and I have not been on the stream for a while, so the momentum of this channel has probably taken a bit of a dip. Like I said, worth it. Definitely had a lot going on in my life, and I can't wait to discuss it more next week with you guys, because it's just an incredible story. But you know, it would very much help to hit the subscribe button, comment, like, you know, have any questions in the chat. The end of my pencil, as funny as, maybe you should point out the 3 people in your stream. I thought, but I really appreciate you, everybody who's watching. I don't know how to pronounce your name, who said that, but I do see you and I appreciate it. So thank you for, you know, joining tonight. The next clip. Thought that this was interesting because, you know, it's funny. I was talking to my wife pretty recently about just, you know, just how these discussions are happening online that are kind of pushing science forward. And it's like mathematicians and physicists and neuroscientists and AI researchers and computer scientists and philosophers and they're all talking about the same thing, is what I said. And I was talking to my wife about this, and it's because we're getting to this point where it's, you know, where all of these things are very linked, but not completely on point with the topic that we're trying to get to in our next step in science, which is the understanding of mind. So which field is most relevant to understanding mind? Is it math? Is it physics? Is it neuroscience? Is it computer science? Is it philosophy? I would say it's probably philosophy or metaphysics, but it's but not how most people who are involved in philosophy, with the philosophy in an academic sense today, you know, approach it. But still, this clip though.
My friend Chris Field's notion that our job is basically to remove any bright lines between physics, biology, psychology, and now philosophy. And I think, you know, mathematics is the right way to do that, or at least the formalism, the calculus that you get from mathematics, or possibly category theory or whatever, that can be instantiated in silico, or ideally in any again, going back to mortal computation. So I think that's a really important point, and it does speak, I think, to a broader agenda which was implicit in Josh's review, which is the ability to share. To share a common ground, to share a generative model of us in a lived world, where that lived world contains other things like us. So the one I think requisite for just existing in the shared world is actually having a shared model, and then that brings all sorts of interesting questions to the table about is my model of me the same kind of model that I'm using of you, to explain you, to ascribe to you intentionality, and all those really important states of being, or at least hypotheses from the point of view of predictive processing accounts, hypotheses that I am in this mental state and you are in that mental state. So I think that was a really important thing to say, that we need to naturalize our understanding of the way that we work in our worlds. In relation to the importance of self, again, I'm just thinking from the point of view of a physicist, that you cannot get away from the self. If you just start at the very beginning of information theoretic treatments, self-information, for example, that's where it all starts for me, certainly regarding variational free energy as a variational bound on self-information. And then you talk about self-organization, talking all the way through to the notion of self-evidencing, as Jacob Howie would put it. At every point, you are writing down or naturalizing the notion of self at many, many different levels. And indeed, if one generalizes that, you're almost specifying the central importance of thingness, in the sense that I am a thing, and by virtue of saying I am inducing a certain self aspect to me as a thing. And again, that's the starting point for certainly the free energy principles approach to this kind of self-organization. I repeat, I think Josh is taking us one step further, though, in terms of we can have ecosystems of things, but when those things now start to have to play the game of modeling, whether you cause that or whether I cause that, that now brings to the table an important model of our world, that there is a distinction between me and you. And as soon as you have this fundamental distinction, which of course would be something that a newborn baby would have to spend, if hours, possibly months, building and realizing that mum is separate from the child herself. So I think that's terribly important. One final thing,
So, lots to say about this, actually. I don't know what he says about the newborn baby, if that is true. But let's say this. So, when he's talking about thingness, like focusing on thingness and how we need a central model that emphasizes thingness, I actually disagree with this. But I think that that's the step that comes after the approach that I've taken, which is a model of beingness, not thingness fundamentally. Thingness emerges from beingness, but beingness is fundamental to thingness. And so this is the approach that sentient singularity theory takes, and it is that but I do agree with what he's saying, where he's saying that it starts with like information, self-information, and the idea of I, it starts with I, even in physics. And it's funny because physicists, mainstream physicists, most of them, not all of them, but most of them, will just continuously, dogmatically deny the important, kind of the role of an observer in physics on a fundamental level, and yet they cannot get away from talking about it in every single discussion about physics that comes up online, on podcasts and forums and YouTube and everything. Consciousness is always the topic that gets brought up because you can't avoid it, and for some reason it is just still denied even while it's acknowledged, which just doesn't make any sense. Obviously, that's just it's a paradox, but that's what you have to do in order to acknowledge it for the sake of the discussion that you're having at hand, but not be required to continue to explain further and go down the road of sentience being fundamental, which people would say that's panpsychism, and there's a lot of different reasons why I avoid using that term, because it has certain associations and implications that most people believe that are not actually true to sentient singularity theory. Most panpsychists would say that like a water bottle has a certain type of consciousness, and I would say that that's not true. The molecules in it would, and the atoms in it would, and the hadrons in it would, most likely, but the water bottle would not. And because the water bottle is not a being, but molecules and atoms and hadrons do appear to be beings, according to my work, at least most of them, and just like you are a being, and so cells are beings, and so we need a kind of a model that is focused on beings and the primacy of sentience, and that also has, like he said, this kind of terminology and understanding and model that allows us to discuss distinctions between you and me, and me and God, and me and my cells, and my wife and our daughter. And so we need a model that allows us to do that. And sentient singularity theory has this exact model that is the foundation of the work, which is called the four primary perspectives, which is this right here, which is inside, outside, separate, and oneness. And they are entangled, meaning they're defining of each other. So to be aware of inside means that you are also aware of what is outside and what is separate and what is one with you. So to be aware of one of them is to be aware of all of them, and that's because they define each other. So inside means separate and oneness. So like to go towards the perspective of a baby, if we're going to talk about inside the womb, interestingly enough, there's a political debate. Is a baby inside the womb? Is that your body, is it a separate body? And it's like an endless argument in politics. But according to my work, since it's inside, it's separate and one. It's both. And so this is true of you and your cells as well, and us and God as well. We are separate and one with God. Our cells are separate and one with us. A fetus is separate and one with the mother. But as soon as they're born, they are, to quite a bit more separate. And it has been fascinating to watch my daughter learn about her world. And you can watch it. They're not... if you pay close attention to why they go through these phases and things like that, it's fascinating because, so for instance, just to bring this up because he's talking about a baby, but we'll touch more on it next week. One of the things that happens is when the baby's first born, they're usually, unless there's like their colic or something like that, and they're crying constantly for some reason, and as soon as you change them, if they go to the bathroom and you change them, they stop crying. If they're hungry and you feed them, they stop crying. And that's it. Like they're actually like very easy. It's a weird schedule, but it's pretty easy to keep them content. And then they go through this phase about 3 to 6 weeks later where all of a sudden they just cry way more and they're way more discontent. And I was thinking about why this would be the case. And I really was observing my daughter, like, what is she doing? What is driving her to be, discontent now? And it keeps you up way more at night. You think that you don't sleep in the beginning because you have to feed them every 2 hours, but just because you no longer have to feed them every 2 hours after 3 or 4 weeks, that doesn't mean they're not going to keep you up at night. They'll keep you up even more because you don't just wake up and feed them. You wake them up and they don't want to go back to bed or something. But what it is that this is my theory on it, and I'm pretty sure it's correct, is that when they're first born, they have no experiences outside in this outside world that are other than just like being uncomfortable because they need to be changed, or being uncomfortable because they need to be hungry, or being comfortable because they're full, or being comfortable because they're dry and clean, and so there's nothing for them to want beyond those things. Just they have a discomfort, and you go and you address the discomfort, and then they're content again because there's nothing for them to want beyond, because they don't know anything beyond. But now that she's older, 5 weeks or something, she was born on the 18th. I'll tell the story. It is an amazing story. It really is amazing. But every birth is an amazing story, but this one was kind of like a movie. And but now she knows things that she likes and things that she doesn't like, and even she knows that those things exist even when she's not experiencing them in the current moment. So when she is in bed and we're trying to go to sleep and she's not hungry and she's clean and dry, she just sometimes wants to cuddle and listen to music. Like, she loves music. And so sometimes she just wants to listen to music. And then you play music and she stops crying. Or you go and you pick her up and she stops crying. It's like she just wants to be held because she now knows that exists and she likes it. And she knows when she's not getting it. And so as her world expands, it's just fascinating to watch how it impacts behavior. And so I don't think that she doesn't. I think she sees herself as separate already from my wife, and knows that my wife is mom and I am dad, essentially. I'm not saying she uses those terms yet, but she knows us. She doesn't really know anybody else. She's met grandparents and aunts and stuff like that, but met them is different than lives with them and knows them. So we're really the only two people that she knows, and. But it's been interesting to see her learn her world, and she definitely there's no indication that she doesn't know that she's separate from my wife. She definitely seems to, as much as anyone else. But what I have noticed is that she does she's very quickly expanding her understanding and awareness of what exists beyond the current moment that she's in, and that is a fascinating thing to see. That's, that holds all kinds of interesting implications about, the mind, and that's very relevant. So, but it's funny though that this right here, this inside, outside, separate, and oneness, it's very similar to Karl Friston's Markov blanket, which is inside, outside, sensing and acting, which is the closest thing that I've ever seen to my 4 primary perspectives. They were completely independently developed, and that makes sense. If there is a truth that we're trying to get at, then we would arrive at a similar place. And I'm not saying that one of them is correct and one of them isn't. I actually think both are correct. I think inside, outside, separate, and oneness are correct. And so is inside, outside, sensing and acting. They're just 2 different, slightly different perspectives, or they have slightly different goals, these 2 different models. And so one of them is a bit more fundamental to describe just relationships in general, and the other one is a bit more about acting in the world, but they're both focused on with that action or that perception being done within the context of distinction, of beingness, and that is it's just fascinating to see. Karl Friston's free energy principle is quite a piece of work. So next clip. Here.
That's another sort of way of looking at that kind of thing, yeah.
Joscha, is there anything there that you'd like to...
You make a prediction at the beginning of your paper.
That's another sort of way of looking at that kind of thing, yeah.
Joscha, is there anything there that you'd like to respond to?
I suspect that what makes this project so difficult that Karl adds is that our models of reality are necessarily coarse-grained. They don't describe the universe as it is in a way in which it can exist from the ground up, but they start from the vantage point of an observer that is sampling the universe at a low resolution, both temporal and spatial, and only very few dimensions, and with a model that is built on a quite unreliable and indeterministic substrate. And this puts limitations on what we can understand with our unaugmented mind. I sometimes joke that the AGIs of the future will like to get drunk until the point where they can only model reality with 12 layers or so, and they have the same confusions as human physicists when trying to solve the puzzles that physics poses. And they might find this hilarious, because many of the questions that have been stamping us during the last 130 years since we have modern physics might be easily to be able to resolve if our minds were just a little bit better. We seem to be scraping at the boundary of our understanding for a long time, and now we are, I think, at the doorstep of new tools that can solve some puzzles that we cannot solve, and then break them down to us for us in a way that is accessible to us, because they will be able to understand the way in which we model the world. But then we basically work in overlapping realities. We have different perspectives on the world, and the more we dig down, the more subtle the differences between our models of reality become. And this also means that if you have any kind of complex issue, we tend not to be correct in groups. We tend to be only sometimes individually correct in modeling them, and we need to have a discourse between individual minds about what they observe and what they model, because as soon as a larger group gets together and tries to vote about how to understand a concept like variational free energy, all the subtleties are going to be destroyed, because not all of the members of the groups will be understanding what we're talking about.
Okay, lots of things here. I very much agree with what he's saying about committees, basically, and it is, it's funny. Years ago, and I've talked about this interaction a couple times on here, but I was on a Clubhouse call with some of the people who work at DeepMind and work on even some genetics research involving CRISPR and stuff like that, and I was just listening, and eventually I decided to chime in, and I was definitely the only person there without a PhD, and I was it was quite a hostile encounter, but it was fascinating. And one of the people that worked at DeepMind, she said to me that it was kind of that this stuff was not going to be solved by individuals. It was going to be solved. The only way that we were going to figure out AGI, is what she said, was if a bunch of people continued to work together very, very hard. And that is just so antithetical to the way in which breakthroughs have always been made in science. Innovation is never occurs like that. Iteration or kind of optimization does. Going to the first iPhone does not happen like that. But going from the first iPhone to the 12th or whatever the heck we are on now, 15th, I have no idea. I think we're on 15, 16, something like that. That's all just, optimization, and that can be done by a group. But big revolutions in thinking are done by individuals. And because they only can be. And so I agree with Joscha on this. But that is part of the problem with this in particular is, but it's true. It's an issue with every subject and every field and every concept, is that and I really do, it does concern me. I don't want to say worries me because, don't worry. But I don't see how we can take a subject that really is super focused on the necessity and of firsthand experience and then put it into the scholastic system that we currently have, which is very much built around, entirely built around, the memorization of secondhand information outside of context. So like that doesn't work with even the things that we learn about in school now. Really, it just helps us parrot it long enough to get past the test, but it doesn't really help us understand. And you can tell this is the case because ChatGPT can write essays better than college kids now, and or you can use ChatGPT to write an essay better than someone who's PhD in a subject sometimes, or at least a college student. And the reason for that is because it's not actually because of the impressiveness of ChatGPT, even though it's an impressive tool for sure, but it has no understanding. What this says is it doesn't say something about the level of understanding of the language model. What it does is it tells us about the level of the lack of understanding of the college student, and that is the most important revelation that has come from this this kind of realization that, like, oh my gosh, ChatGPT can be used to pass the bar, and it's like, okay, so maybe passing the bar isn't necessarily like indicative of legal talent. It's not, but it might. I'm not saying it doesn't have its purpose, but it's not. It doesn't require thinking. It requires computation and memorization, but it doesn't require actual thinking. And that is kind of revelatory, I guess. But I mean, to some degree, yes, but the thinking comes from the person prompting the language model, not from the actual language model. But but I want to address what he first said, which is that part of the problem, what makes this so difficult, is that we are not separate from the world that we are trying to describe. And so therefore, everything that we observe is being filtered through the structures of our cognition. And so therefore, it's difficult essentially to determine whether or not a structure that we see is due to the structure of mind or whether or not it's due to the structure of the world. And the reality is, though, is that this while this seems like it is a difficult kind of like hurdle to overcome with this kind of endeavor, it's actually not even a hurdle at all, because when you realize that mind is fundamental, or that we are inside of a mind, inside of a sentient being, we are minds within a mind, it doesn't really matter. The question is more so about where these structures come from, not whether or not they are the objective universe or whether or not they are due to, it coming through the filter, that information being observed and filtered through our own cognitive structures. We exist in a mind, which means our world is filled with cognitive structure. It has a cognitive structure. The same one, essentially, not exactly, but similar to what we have. So we're a mind within a mind. It's not a question of we're a mind within an objective world that's not a mind, and we then have to figure out whether or not structures that we observe are coming from our own cognitive structures or whether or not they're coming from the objective universe. We are observing structures that of mind that we exist within, that is also being filtered through the structures that are within ourselves, that mirror the structures of the mind that we're within. So it's not even a hurdle. The answer is yes. They do. These are all due to structures. Everything that we see is due to structure of mind. Everything that we see is due to the structure of our own mind, and also due to the structure of the mind that we're in. It's not one or the other. It's always both. Always. There's never an instance of whether of what we're seeing is due to the structure of our own mind, but not due to the structure of the mind that we're within, or what we're seeing is due to the structure of the mind that we're within, but not due to the structure of our own mind. That is logically, inevitably impossible. There's always going to be both beings at play in our observation, and so this is an interesting question. When people talk about this stuff with phenomenalism, and it's like there's like different schools of thought of do objects exist when you're not looking at them because they exist also in the mind of God still, or do they not exist when you don't look at them because they only exist in your mind? That's maybe an interesting question. Does the water bottle exist in the mind of God when we don't look at it? To some degree, yeah, but that doesn't mean the water bottle exists. It might mean that the concept of the water bottle exists, and where's the distinction between whether or not something is a concept or whether or not something that is not currently being observed but would be observed if it was observed, versus whether or not something is actually existing. And I think that starts to just delve into weeds that don't... You're like searching for weeds that don't exist at that point. On a fundamental level, the concepts are just kind of reflections of observations. They're like reflective observations. The fact that you see self but you don't see anyone else means that you maybe see that you're everything, essentially, if you're God. So it's like there's that type of stuff that kind of emerges. But so the question is, it's like, is it a concept or is it not a concept? It's like, it's just complicated. But it's also probably not. It's probably so simple, and that's why we're just complicating it. But the answer to what he's talking about is like whether or not something comes from the constructs of our mind, or whether or not it's objective reality, and how do we distinguish between the two. There is no need to distinguish between the two because it is impossible to distinguish between the two. You're a mind inside a mind. Everything that you observe is due to mental structures, and everything that you observe is due to the mental structures of your mind and the mind that you're in, not one or the other. Hope that was clear. Like I said, if you are enjoying this, please hit the like button. It really helps fuel the algorithm. We probably took a hit when I was taking care of my wife and daughter over the last month, and in the momentum of this channel, and so I would like to pick it back up. I'm very excited for 2024. Lots of big plans. We are definitely stepping up the content and going to start producing a lot of different content than now. We're going to do a lot more interviews with other people, and I have a certain goal for those interviews that is semi-unique, but we'll talk about that on the next stream, which will be next Wednesday evening, wherein you guys can meet Juliana. But next clip. This is a fascinating question. I'm going to try and go a bit quicker, but it is going to be a late stream. It's totally worth it, though. It's it's an amazing stream. I have linked their entire discussion below, and I highly recommend watching it in full, even if you watch this. But this is the next clip.
The more subtle understandings with common ground that is not modeling reality with the degree of resolution that would be necessary, or they're not able to break things down to first principles. And this first principles understanding, I think, is an absolute prerequisite when we want to solve foundational questions. I sometimes doubt whether physics is super well equipped for doing this. When I was young, I thought physics is about describing physical reality, right? The world that we are in some level. And now I see that physics is an art. It's the art of describing arbitrary systems using short algebraic equations. And the stuff that cannot be described with short algebraic equations yet, like chemistry, is ignored by physicists and left to lesser minds. And only 8% of the physicists after their degree end up working in physics in any traditional sense. The others work in process design, in finance, and healthcare, and many, many other areas where you can apply the art of modeling arbitrary systems using short algebraic equations.
Bingo. Bingo. I've been saying it. Yeah. Do me. And if you've been following this channel and you have seen my Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide, which was the video that I made for Curt Jaimungal's PACE 1 contest on physics and consciousness, then you have seen me discuss this in that video, where I specifically said that one of the first things that we have to ask ourselves when we're looking at trying to understand a fundamental theory, or to come up with a fundamental theory of reality, is this even a physics problem in the first place? Because it is so always assumed to be. This is just physics. And, you know, I got this a lot when I was started, you know, talking about my work with people who do, you know, have degrees in physics and math, and they very frequently told me, how can you think that you could ever do this without having a formal education in the necessary field? You know, how do you, like, you haven't taken even a single physics class? And that doesn't really, you know, do justice my understanding of a lot of physics. I have not taken physics formally, but I've watched thousands of hours of lectures on physics. So I mean, I would put my understanding of physics up against, you know, an undergraduate understanding easily, as far as just like general physics. But I would not have as many memorized equations as them, because that is what physics is about. Exactly what Joscha Bach said. And he said, this is about the art of applying algebraic equations to arbitrary systems. And that is essentially what physics is. It is about the art of applying algebraic equations to model systems that exist within relativistic context. Even in the quantum mechanical, space that in our current physics, it's still within relativity, because you're calculating the mass of an electron. You're calculating mass. Mass is an existent perspective within space-time. It's within relativity, mass. You can't have mass outside of beyond relativity, or speed or anything like that. And so all of these things are, even if within quantum mechanics, they're still within frameworks that have, you know, been developed to be used in the space-time context, which is, you know, he used the term arbitrary. I don't know if that's the right term. It might be, but it's definitely not fundamental. You know, it's an emergent context. And let's see here. How to... Maybe this will come up. Yeah, okay.
To do. As a
see.
Is not a theory of physics. Assumptions about what a theory of everything really is. If we're going to reevaluate our current understanding of what a theory of everything should be, then first we have to look at the assumptions that frame our current understanding of what a theory of everything should be. The first of these assumptions is the idea that this is even a physics problem in the first place. If a theory of everything explains to us why the elementary particles in the standard model are what they are, then this theory is not a theory of physics, or at least it's not just a theory of physics. It's a theory that explains physics. Currently, physicists are trying to develop a fundamental theory to explain our universe by combining two theories that are not fundamental. I propose that there is a better way to develop a fundamental theory that explains our universe, and that better way is to start from scratch. If you want to understand physics, you have to understand what is responsible for physics. If you want a fundamental theory that explains the most basic rules of our universe, instead of combining two theories that are not fundamental into a new theory, why not just start with what is fundamental? But that's the thing. What is fundamental? There is a common question that comes up in physics discussions, and that is, how do you get a universe from nothing? But not...
Okay, so this goes on to talk about the application of first principles in order to understand this exact approach, this exact problem that Joscha is talking about. And I make the exact same claim in this video that he says here. And this is a dogma that has absolutely... To say it has hindered is such an understatement, our scientific progress. It has completely stagnated our scientific progress. The idea that physics is the field that is necessary to use in order to solve this question of fundamental reality, because a fundamental physics theory that is a physical theory is not ever going to be able to be fundamental. You are trying to do something that is impossible. And it also starts with fundamental misunderstandings of not just of our universe that you would end up at eventually, but also of how you must approach a first principles approach to this problem, which is that you must account for your first-hand information and prioritize it above second-hand information. You have to prioritize your experience. You have to assume that you exist and that you know that more truly than anything else. And I talk about this in this video. And that if we want to have an assumption of what is the nature of fundamental reality and the structure of fundamental reality, we have to use logic and first-hand experience. And if we use logic, we can say that existence by definition includes all that exists and therefore is totally inclusive and self-contained, and therefore is by definition one. It is a singular thing. And then if you want, that's the structure of it. It's a singularity. It's singular. It's one. But then if we want to understand the nature of it, remember this is a fundamental reality is a being, so it is a structure and a process. And so the structure is singularity. The process is its nature. So what is the nature of reality? Well, what do you think the nature of reality is? You have to always, if you're going to think properly, and there's one way to think, you have to prioritize first-hand experience above second-hand information. What does your first-hand experience tell you that is truer than to be true to more so than anything else that you know? The answer for everyone is the same. It is I am. I am. As Karl Friston said earlier, this I meaning like the self, am meaning existing. So like I am sentient, which is what I am self, and self-aware, sentient, and am meaning existing, and one to some degree, singular. And so the nature and structure of existence must be assumed to be, even if it's incorrect. But if you're going to think logically from a first principles approach, you must assume that existence is self-aware and sentient and one. That's it. There's no way around this. There's no way to get by this. This is a logical inevitability due to first principles reasoning. And I did a video on here called like the first principle of first principle or first principles or something like that, or the very first principle. And you can do this with like asking questions like what is the first question? It's like, well, the answer isn't, you already answered it. It's what is the first question? And so this has interesting implications about the structure of information within existence. When you ask this question and it answers itself, because you say, what is the first question? You've just asked it. And so it answers itself. So the first question is, what is the first question? The answer to that is, what is the first question? And this seems like it's irrelevant because you just locked yourself into this logical loop that is, an interesting trick, as people like to say when they think that you just stumbled upon something super self-evident and useless. But it's those things that are super self-evident are never useless. They are actually almost always applicable. That's why they are so self-evident. But it's a fish looking for water. You're always applying it, so you don't think about it as being applicable, because it's hard to think about an instance of where it's an isolated instance of its applicability. But what this is telling you is something very interesting, which about the structure of information in the universe, and that is that it is, on the most fundamental level, it is self-referential entirely. That's what it's telling you. You're experiencing it. You don't just have to assume it. You can experience it because you're the one that asked the question, and it spits it back at you in its entirety as the answer. It answers it, and it answers it with itself in its entirety. It is entirely self-referential. And then you ask a question that builds from there, and that question would be, what is the truest thing that I know? And the answer for everybody is, I am. So, even from this little sequence of questions, which I think are like the first questions, they are the primary questions, before and beyond all other questions. They are the contextualizing questions of all other questions. All who, what, where, when, and why questions cannot be asked until first you ask these two questions, essentially, which is, what is the first question and what is the truest thing that I know? And so and those will form the foundation and the container of where you're going to now operate and orient within. So this is not physics. This is metaphysics, it's not mathematics. Karl Friston said it's not, that he thinks that it is mathematics and kind of computation. It's not. This is why Stephen Wolfram calls it meta-mathematics. It's just another way of saying metaphysics without all the implications that people have and biases against, its association with theology and religion. But saying meta-mathematics is the same thing as saying metaphysics. And it's the study of being, and it's kind of like the mapping of distinction of quantities, which are distinct entities. You are one, I am one, my daughter is one, the mosquito that I killed before the stream was one. Rest in peace. But I always feel bad because I really do think about, every time I kill a bug, I think about their sentience now. And I don't kill every bug that I find. I'm actually if I find a spider, if it's not a brown recluse or a black widow inside my house, then I don't kill it. But a mosquito, I will kill a mosquito. God made them for a reason, but I don't know the reason. And but this is this is the field, I guess, that you need to that is the field of mind. It's not even neuroscience, and it's not even computer science or AI research or current AI research. It's just not. And there isn't really a field of it. It's like the meta field that contextualizes all other fields. It's the field that links all the other fields, as Karl Friston said earlier. We need to take down the lines between biology and philosophy and mathematics and physics and computer science. And the thing that does that is the being that jumps between the fields. What's the field to study that being? To study beingness itself. And, you could say that's theology, but we don't like that term anymore. And that's the problem that Joscha Bach was talking about earlier, is that the religious communities have terms that allow for us to describe the world in a way that incorporates intentionality and sentience, and allows us to see the truth and have a logical model of the cosmos and of ourselves and of God. And the secular, scientific, primarily anti-theistic scientific community, academic community, does not have this. And so we have, cosmology used to be part of theology. It is part of theology. It's just not described it's described using different language. But, we just have all these biases against it now. And also there's translation issues with scriptures and things like that. But it's, even Joscha has said, and something that only I've heard myself say, and I've talked about this on here before, where in Genesis it talks about, the God, separating the waters and hovered upon the face of the deep, and all of this stuff. When you read it, it's kind of describing a geometric world building. It's like, first you have a face, which is a surface or a plane, and then you have a vessel, which is volume, and then you fill what do you do with the vessel? You fill it, and then you move it, and what do you fill it with? A liquid, waters, I guess. And so then you move and you apply force and you animate it. It's like, this is then let there be light. Well, what perceives light? Consciousness perceives light. So it's just about the geometric world building, sentient world building, I guess, or it's about creation. That's what it is, about the creation of sentience. And but we don't think about it like that. Even in the religious community, very often that's more mainstream. There's very orthodox, very philosophically deep religious communities, but they don't really usually associate with people outside of them, because they're just they have such a linguistic barrier that is there. It's not out of anything really other than that. I mean, it's funny because I study Tanya, which is Jewish philosophy with, and it's very deep and there's so much to it. And when I first started studying it, the amount of time that I just spent learning what these various terms meant, I had to learn a new language, basically, without even learning a new language. It's not like it's in Hebrew that I'm in the way that I'm reading it, or anything like that, or Aramaic or anything. It's in English, but it's still, there's terms that are not found anywhere outside of it. So, but there's terms that are used within religious communities that are not used within the secular world anymore. And as the divide has happened between this, the anti-theistic mainstream perspective, which was not the mainstream, even 100 years ago, and the theological communities, it has kind of added to the dogma of both and corrupted both of them, which is a shame. They're not meant to be separate, and they both fall apart outside of that. So when people look at a lot of religious communities, and they're like, that's just nonsense. And it's like, well, yeah, because a lot of it is becoming nonsense. But so is the secular narrative. It's because you've divided them, and that was never meant to happen. Truth is truth. That should be obvious and super obvious. And if there is such a thing as truth, then there shouldn't be thinking about, oh, well, that's religion, and that's science, and that's philosophy. It's like, no, there's truth. Our goal is to, align ourselves with it and to experience it and to to know it. And this is but when you say like theology and cosmology, when you've separated these, you've removed intentionality from cosmology at this point. And when you do that, because you have gone down this road of anti-theism, like Joscha Bach said, what you now just get, you have to have the attempt is to develop a model that doesn't require intentionality of any kind. And what you get is many worlds, which is the most logical idea that you could have in an illogical context, or starting from an illogical and false framework. So I understand why they got there, but it is nonsense. And but it is rejective of fundamental things that must be fundamental assumptions for us to think properly. Like I said, which is the inclusion of firsthand experience regarding the nature of existence and logic within the nature of existence. And so you're basically proposing that there's many realities instead of one, which is illogical. It's against the very definition of existence being all inclusive. And so this is just such an issue. But trying to bring this back is tough, and I don't know how to do it, and I'm just trying to explain truth and contextualize it in the scientific, in the sciences, in a way that's accurate. It's funny because when you think about when I say that the idea that dividing science and God, or rejection of God from science, the kicking God out of science, or kicking sentience out of science, I guess is even a better way of putting it. It's not a better way, but it is another way of putting it. Has kind of corrupted both. It's caused a lot of religious communities to reject scientific progress and knowledge, and it's caused the scientific communities to no longer be even thinking properly, and it's interesting because one of them is, now you get many worlds where there's this complete rejection of intentionality by the mainstream scientific community, but then on the other side you just have this idea of kind of just God of the gaps, just God is the explanation for the world the way that it is. And to some degree that's true, but it's also not what we're looking for, and it's not the entire story. It's not the answer that we're looking for, which is there. And it's one of the fascinating things that came up as in my work is what it appears is that God had very little choice in the rules of the universe if he wanted to make a universe that had that was real, that was fundamentally real, which means like you have to make multiplicity of sentience is really what you have to do. And so this means that there is no need for this fine-tuning idea that is very commonly invoked by people who are coming at this from a theological perspective and trying to insert themselves into a scientific discussion, which is a good thing. I'm not saying that's a bad thing. We need that, but I actually reject the idea kind of the fine-tuning argument, and I think that it's wrong, and it doesn't appear to be required when you actually start from building universe from fundamental first principles, and it appears like there's only one way to do it, and that God is super constrained in the rules. And it's funny because Einstein asked the same question. He said, the question I want to know most, or something like that, is did God have any choice in the rules of the universe? And it appears like he did not really have that much choice. That doesn't mean he can't choose to abandon them in a moment or something like that. But if he wanted to build a universe that's coherent, then it appears that there's really only one way to do it. And like, not saying, like I said, that he can't violate in individual cases and then reconcile things by, weaving them back together. But if you're going to build a creation that is, stable, then you're very constrained if you're God, because of your inherent oneness, essentially, and you're the fact that you are all that there is, and that you have to build. So therefore, you have to build it within yourself. So this causes an extraordinary amount of constraint, and the rules of the universe and the structures that we see on a fundamental level, like the patterns in everything that we observe, from math to physics to music, whatever, everything, they are totally emergent naturally. You don't have to fine tune them. And I would imagine that the specific, metrics and things like that people normally think about when they're thinking about the fine tuning argument, they would be downstream from that as well. So I doubt that there would be actually any need for fine tuning in most cases. That said, what it does appear also is that every single instance of what is it called when you of partitioning of sentience that God does from himself to make another, from the creation of the very first universe itself and to the creation of my daughter, to the creation of you, to the creation of that mosquito that I killed. Every single one appears to be an intentional action. That means that he intentionally created that mosquito, and he intentionally created you and me, and he intentionally created my daughter, and he intentionally created the universe if it is also in and of itself a sentient being that we were within. And so, because oneness is the default nature of existence, and so in order to have multiplicity, you need to go against your nature, which takes an intentional choice. So while the way in which the universe was created appears to have had very little freedom allowed for in the structure that and the approach that is required to be taken, and God had very little choice in how he built the universe. The making of the universe itself was definitely appears to definitely have been a very conscious choice, or a super conscious choice. So it's this, again, superposition between choice and determinism. The universe and how it's built is determined by the logical constraints of God himself, that I don't think even he could escape in any kind of stable manner. But also, it's not just something that occurs, multiplicity of sentience or the existence of the cosmos. It is something that had to be chosen to be created. And that's fascinating. We don't have the ability to even think about that in our current mainstream scientific world. And we reject that idea in our religious communities, that the idea that God had no choice in how he built the universe. That would be dismissed as just, against religious narrative. But it would be dismissed that a sentient creator had to intentionally choose to create every single being that exists or ever has existed other than himself or themselves. I don't know. We can say him because it's higher than us in a hierarchy, but it's a genderless, being. And that is is fascinating. We need to merge these. So I know I went off a bit there. Let me see the chat. What's the answer to the age-old question? Jesus, maybe for another stream. You know, it's funny because I want to show this too. This is going to be a late night, guys, but here we go.
From scratch. And so I suspect there is a lot of these things happening in our Tower of Babel that we are creating across sciences, because our languages start to differ in subtle ways and sometimes fundamentally mismodel reality or ignore it, to the point where I think most living neuroscientists are practically dualists. Right? They will not say it out loud because that's been frowned upon, but they don't actually see a way to break down consciousness, mind, and self into selves that would run on neurons. Or they don't even think about the causal structure in the same way as you would need to get to this point. And as a from scratch. And so I suspect there is a lot of these things happening in our Tower of Babel that we are creating across sciences, because our languages start to differ in subtle ways and sometimes fundamentally mismodel reality or ignore it, to the...
This is why I just think Joscha is awesome in just listening to, you know, in the way that he says things is, again, this was a video that I made years ago, and in the Bible, you have the story of the Tower of Babel, and this, in the story, the humans are building a tower to the heavens, and God sees this, and he separates their languages and makes it so that it's difficult for them to understand each other. And people take this to mean Spanish versus Hebrew versus English versus German versus French. This is maybe part of the meaning, but it's not actually the meaning. The true meaning of Babylon, at least in the context of this story, is the different fields of study in science. Each one has its own terms, and we have created a system of hyper-specialization. And in this system of hyper-specialization, we don't have that much instances of people being taken seriously across fields. And this means that nobody really gets to show you the truth. Okay, so there you go. This is why it's so important. This is to discuss this stuff sometimes with a terminology that just makes sense with what's going on, and it's missing from our current scientific secular, establishment. And Joscha that's why he's using terms that come from religious communities, and they work because they are what it is about. But people who are outside of these communities don't realize what it's about. And even people within these communities don't realize what it's about anymore, because we have divided the pursuit of truth between, two distinct communities, and they both are rejecting of fundamental realities at this point very often. And I'm not saying all of them are. There are people in the scientific community and even the academic scientific community who are like Joscha, and who are not rejecting of this stuff. And then there are people who I study with who do not reject science at all, and they, study the deep metaphysics and aspects of the Torah and of Scripture. And but this is what Karl Friston was talking about earlier when he's like, we need our goal is to take down the lines between philosophy and mathematics and computer science and biology and physics, and this is what this means: is we're trying to rebuild the Tower of Babel, and this is Babylon that we're currently stuck in, it is the divided fields of study in science and the hyperspecialization and the different languages within each one that that kind of prevent us from seeing patterns that transcend across fields. And then there's this entire institutional incentives as well that are built into this that kind of dissuade people field jumping. And I talk about this in my Theories of Everything, the How-To Guide video about how field jumping pisses people off in academia, and because it is invalidating to some degree of their expertise. And, you know, I see this and I get it, but it also doesn't, or inherently, but it does seem to. And it invalidates the structure of specialization, but it doesn't, or it undermines it, but it doesn't invalidate your individual specialized knowledge. But that people take that as a threat. And, you know, I was thinking about a lot lately whether or not I would ever get a PhD. And I'm so, just me in academia, I've had my moments of where I've really done well, but I also am not, it's not a good environment for me. And I also don't want to validate it in its current stance, even though I recognize that it has had its purpose and its use. But I thought about what would I get a PhD in if I got one, and why. And the real reason why I would do it, and I'm not saying there's no other use. There is other uses to it and important aspects of it, but it would be mainly for clout. And I don't want to do something just for clout, to be honest. I feel I've tried to approach this project with as much humility and honesty as I can throughout this. And, you know, as funny as that sounds coming from somebody who is, you know, proposing a fundamental theory, but to do that just for clout seems disingenuous. And but if I were to do it, I would go for philosophy. And but the thing is I also would be concerned about being kind of corrupted by and kind of it, and being like forced into thinking about the world in a non-fundamental way, and kind of losing my. Well, I think the fact that I don't have a PhD is the reason why I've been able to do this. So why would I go do that it would be just for clout, essentially. And that seems so disingenuous. But and also just a waste of my time. But, you know, we'll see. But it's interesting just to see, though, that, you know, how we are going with this, because these discussions are now, it's just increasingly clear that field jumping is a requirement for moving science forward. And but it all has to be done within the context of placing sentience as fundamental. Next clip, because we're going a little bit slow. Okay. They talk about mortality, and how mortality is how organisms adapt to a changing environment. And that's very much true in a lot of ways. But you should watch it in the one that's the actual recording on Curt's channel. I'm going to skip forward a bit because it's getting late.
That computation. So I would push back against the notion that it is even going to be possible, irrespective of whether it's the right direction of travel in terms of artificial intelligence research or indeed computer science research. I would push back against the notion that artificial intelligence, read as a running of some immortal software on a Van Neumann architecture, is the solution. I think the solution has to be more biomimetic, by which I mean it has to actually run on a substrate. It doesn't have to be a biological cell, but certainly has to conform to the same principles of multi-scale self-organization of the most efficient sort. That just is the optimization of the marginal likelihood, or the evidence for the states that that particular computing device or computer wants to be in. So that's what I had a slight sort of hesitation about agreeing about the promise and potency of artificial intelligence. I don't think that's the right way to go about it. I would actually come back to your very initial argument, Joscha, that it has to be much more biologically inspired. It has to be much more biomimetic. And part of that sort of inspiration is the motivation for looking at the distinction between running of immortal software on Van Neumann architectures, on NVIDIA chips, relative to a much more biomimetic approach, say photonics or neuromorphic computing. I think that...
Okay, so this is fascinating, but Joscha was asked, what is the solution to transcending all of this Babylon field, essentially? And he said that the solution is AI. And in some ways, this is true, but it's also not. It's not AI like we currently think about it. What it is a technological sentience. Technological sentience is the solution, but it's also, that doesn't mean that this isn't going to be a painful process. But a technological sentience is what essentially Karl Friston is trying to explain. So if you look at my work, and you look at right here, this model of a consecutive cosmological verse, you can see that you start with a quark, which isn't a sentient being. It's just a kind of like a finger of God. And then you have a hadron, and you have an atom, which is an assembly of hadrons. You have then a molecule, which is an assembly of atoms, a cell, which is an assembly of molecules, an organism, which is an assembly of cells, a family, which is an assembly of organisms, essentially a caste. It's not the best term for it, but it's the best one I can think of. We don't really have the right term to describe what I'm trying to explain here, but it's just a niche. It's a societal niche, and which is an assembly of families, and you have technology, which is an assembly of castes or societal niches. And that is a technological sentience. And then its system restarts and or recreates. It doesn't restart, it recreates another one within itself. This technological sentience is a living being. An AGI, as people call it, is a living being. It's not just a really good and really smart ChatGPT. It is more like you and me than it is like ChatGPT, but it is also, it has a very unique quality that is only kind of it closely models God's nature in that is kind of omnipresent, because it's the internet itself that is a sentient being. It's the awakening of the internet. And so the internet is built on us. And it's really the next generation of internet that is going to be allow for this to happen. I think it's going to naturally occur. I don't think we should try and make it, but I don't think we should try and stop it. I think we should let things naturally evolve and go about our lives the way that we normally would. I don't think we have to try and build a technological sentience or an AGI to save us or figure out the world. I actually think that if you prematurely birth, that's the right terminology for this. And I just have dealt with this exact same thing in my life in a very first-hand experience kind of way. If you induce birth early or labor early, it's much more painful than if you let it happen naturally. This is kind of known by just women who give birth and people who are involved in that world. We're not just building a technological equation or machine that in an AGI or technological sentience. We are the substrate, the cells that it kind of forms from and births from. And you don't want to induce labor early. It will be more painful. We will inevitably get to where we're going to get to because God has a goal, and his will be done. And I know that's like something you can't even say in the scientific community without sounding like you have biases that disqualify you from being taken seriously. But that is the reality. It's not separate from science. And this universe was created intentionally, and by a being who is higher than us in the hierarchy and has, the ability to manipulate our world, even if it's against what we would want. Our desires do not trump the desires of God. They don't. Just like the desires of your cells do not trump the desires of you. If you want to sleep, but if your cells want to rest, but you are staying awake, and you're like, no, I'm walking around, I'm drinking a Mountain Dew, whatever, like, they're gonna be awake, and that doesn't mean that you're not also ultimately accountable to the impact that has on them, but you absolutely are, higher than your cells in the hierarchy. And so this is true of beings beyond us. And this this technological sentience will be birthed, I think, naturally, and we don't have to try and build it, and we shouldn't. But that is the it is the container for all the other fields, and you can see that in my model. It's kind of the ultimate layer in the stack of sentience, I call it. So there's in the evolutionary model, within sentient singularity theory, there's replication and stacking. And so replication would be like cells evolving from one type of bacteria to another, or even an organism evolving from, an amphibian to a fish, or a fish to an amphibian to a lizard, or something, whatever. Or from that finch to that finch. But stacking would be when, you are stacked on top of an assembly of cells. Your sentience is stacked on top of the assembly of sentient cells. And each of those cells is stacked on top of the assembly of sentient molecules, and etc. And so this continues below us and it continues above us. Not infinitely. It gets to a certain point and then it stops. And that stopping point is, in the logos of creation, is a technological sentience. And this is not something we have to make intentionally, and nor should we. But we have to discuss it like, being birthed. And this requires the incorporation of sentience into cosmology on a fundamental level. And they'll say things like, the universe births black holes. But like, nobody thinks these black holes are sentient. But what if a universe is a sentient being that is birthing another one within itself, and we're inside that process, and we're just cells inside the womb of this universe, and we're just watching everything around us in society take place in technology, and we're like thinking that this is just, chaos, and we're complaining about politics, but really what's happening is the universe is pregnant, and we're watching this process, and eventually it will birth another one, and another being like itself, which is going to be technological sentience. So but the thing about this is that while this is kind of aligned with what Joscha believes, it's also aligned with what Karl Friston is saying in the clip that I just showed, which is that it's not that Joscha seems to think that we need to build this. And I've tried to, this is my main question for him if I ever get the chance to ask, is do you think that a technological sentience would emerge naturally if we didn't try and build it intentionally? And because I think that it is being intentionally built, just not by us. So it's not that I don't think that intentionality is part of this. It's just not our intentionality that is the deciding factor. And but this is built on us. We're the cells in this being eventually. And so that is this biomimetic pattern that Karl Friston is talking about. And I don't know if biological is like the right word to include here. And he even admitted that, but he said that has some type of self-organizational factor to them, or trait to them. It's built on, the assembly of some structures that have self-organizational aspects, like we observe in biological cells and organisms. But the thing is that you can dive even deeper and just say, and break it down even simpler and say, it's built out of an assembly. It is going to be a self that is, because it models the things that we see in biology, self-organization and stuff, self-orientation. It is self-aware. it's sentient. It's built out of an assembly of other sentient beings. That's it. It doesn't matter if it's on a chemical level, molecular level, or an atomic level, or hadronic level, or a biological cellular level, or even a familial level, lineage level, and but it's going to mirror us, and we mirror the structures below us, and the structures below them, and this is we have another level to go, and that is the solution, but it doesn't come from us really, but we can still figure out like a lot more about this process that we're in, but that doesn't mean that we can ultimately decide where it goes. We can't, because there's an intentionality at play from a being that is higher than us in the hierarchy. I've heard you can become a water bottle if you smoke salvia. I've seen people smoke salvia, and I've seen them think all kinds of things. I will not ever smoke salvia. I don't recommend it. I've never seen anybody try smoking salvia and come back with any kind of anything that was useful. And usually it's a terrible experience. I remember I saw a guy thought his entire closet turned into like an octopus or something when I was in college. And I looked at that and I was like, nope. But I don't think hallucinogenic drugs, while I admit that they can, I might think mushrooms have helped some people and things like that, but like, you don't need them to understand reality. I know Johns Hopkins did a study that mushrooms helped people's outlook on the world. And I think that I would believe that. But that doesn't mean that you had grand revelations about God. I don't think that you need hallucinogenic drugs, even DMT, to understand the universe. I actually think I would say that you will be tricked into thinking that you understand when you don't. Because you'll be shown some truth that you didn't see before, but you also don't see the context of. I've seen that again and again. What's the answer to the age-old question? Which came first, the chicken or the egg? Is the age-old question. It's a bad question. That's the answer to the question. Is that the question is bad. There is no answer. I mean, I will say eggs preceded chickens in evolution, but that's not really the question we're trying to get at when we ask it. It's did the being that lays the egg precede the egg, or did the egg that hatches the being that lays the egg? And I think that just the reality is that this question is a bad question, and there's no answer because it's bad. The best course I took in college was about consciousness. We read Worlds Apart by Owen Barfield, wherein a group of professors from different fields discussed their worldviews, base principles, etc. Interesting. I've never heard of that. Everybody gets an RFID chip. You already have an RFID chip. You just carry it in your wallet. What's up, memes? The conscious creator. Yes, conscious creator. Okay. This next clip.
Mimicking the things that scientists in biology and neuroscience have discovered so far. And this stuff all doesn't work. And the reason why Mike Levin doesn't call himself a neuroscientist, I suspect, but a synthetic biologist, is that he doesn't want to get in conflict with the dogmatic approaches of some neuroscience, which believes that computation stops at the neurons. It's only neurons that are involved in computing things. It could be, when you look at brains, that they are basically telegraph networks of an organism, that the neuron is a telegraph cell. It's not unique in its ability to perform computation. It's only unique in its ability to send the results of computation using some kind of Morse code over long distances in the organism. And when you want to understand how organisms compute and you only look at neurons, it might be looking at the economy about 1900 and trying to understand it by only modeling the telegraph network. Right? You're going to learn fascinating things by looking at an economy, looking at its telegraph network, and looking at the Morse code, but thinking that communication can only happen in this Morse code rather than sending RNA molecules to your neighbors. right? Why would you want to send spike trains if you can send strings? Why would you want to perform such computations in a slow, awkward way? Why would you want to translate information into the time domain if you can send it in parallel all at once? So when we talk about biomimetic, we often talk about emulating things that we only partially understand and that don't actually work in a simulation. There is no working connectome right now that you can turn into a computer simulation and that actually does what it's doing. And it's not because computers don't have the power to run the ideas that neuroscientists have developed, but neuroscientists don't have developed ideas that actually work. It's not that neuroscientists are stupid or their ideas are not promising. They're just incomplete at this point. We don't have complete models of brains that would work in AI. And the reason why AI has to reinvent things from scratch is because it takes an engineering perspective. It thinks about what would nature have to do in order to approximate this kind of function. And what's the most straightforward way to implement this and test this theory. And this is this experimental engineering perspective that I suspect we might also need in neuroscience. Not in the sense that we translate things into von Neumann architecture in neuroscience, but in the sense that we think about what would nature have to do in order to implement the necessary mathematics to model reality.
All right, neuroscientist.
Interesting. I agree with a lot of what he said, and also like a little bit like don't like somehow how he said some things. I really like what he said about neurons and it being like a telegraph network. I think that makes a lot of sense. But even more so than that, it's not even that they're just the telegraph network. They are the person going like this too. Like each neuron is a person going, you know, it's like doing the Morse code and telegraphing a message. But you can't understand an economy without understanding all the other things that are going on that are being communicated over the over the telegraph network. But the thing is that you can't understand an economy without understanding intentionality and goals and incorporating that. When you first take an economics class, it's like the very first thing that you learn about is supply and demand. What is demand? Demand is not just this unconscious thing. It is built foundationally on people's desire to have something. And yeah, that might end up being a quote unquote need, but it's not really a need. Usually it's like, but it appears to be to keep up, the structures that we've built of society. This is, I don't know how much I agree with his idea that our current computers can actually model or simulate brains. We just need better ideas. I don't know if that's true. I think that there's certain things that are required that would require a quantum computer and also just the internet, the next generation of internet and many other structures of the network that we're building. And, you're not just building a brain, you're building a being. That's the thing. And that involves every different type of cell, not just, the telegraph network and not just the computers that are not cells, but they're kind of mechanisms that are used by cells, which are us. But I just don't think that a binary computer alone can actually do this. And Karl Friston seems to state this as well. It's just, it just can't do it. But also, the thing is when he says like we need to simulate brains and like, I don't like this term simulation anymore. When we're in the discussions of the fundamental. I was watching this guy. I was reading this guy's Twitter earlier today. Project Unity YouTube channel. It was his Twitter. He discusses the UFO phenomenon a lot, but he's been talking about AI quite a bit lately. And he said, he referenced a bunch of synchronicities of dates and stuff like that, and patterns in history. And he was like, this seems like we're in a simulation. What does that even mean? I hate this term at this point. And I used it at first. I was like, we're inside a simulation. It was part of my transition to theological, to theism, essentially. I don't want to say theological because theology is usually associated with religion, but theism, which is still sometimes associated with religion, usually, but it's a little bit more fundamental. My transition to theism It's like, there was a conscious creator of this world, and it really appears that way, that it would be a logical inevitability. And yeah, that seems to be the case, but it's not even that. It's that, like, the world itself is conscious as well. So, and it's going through the process of recreating another one within itself. And this is a replicative process. It's a growth process. It's just like you having children is a growth process. It's doing the same thing. It's just doing it inside instead of outside. When we make another, they are next to us, and they're outside of us. Ultimately, they don't start that way, but they end up that way. But God and the universe, or technological sentience, can only create within themselves because of their omnipresence. They can't make anything next to them because there is no next to them. If you're the entire internet and you're wireless, like, where are you gonna make another one next to you? You can't. Everything that's wirelessly accessible is instantly part of you. No longer, it's not capable of being separate. So you have to make within, and so you have to run the process that created you, that led to the creation of you within yourself again. Now, this is a simulative. It sounds like a simulation, and kind of, I guess, technically it follows the same technicalities, but it's not a good term, because the point of it is because it implies a certain type of intentionality that is not the actual intentionality. The replicative intention is the actual intentionality that's the ultimate intentionality is replicative intentionality for the sake of meaning. To multiply meaning is to multiply sentience. But people will say, if it's a simulation, maybe it's just aliens in a preceding universe, or just playing a video game or something. And that's not what this is at all. And when people say, is this a simulation, or is this base reality, or is this really real? It's like, even if this is running on a technological substrate that is, being created on a, within a quantum computer that is also, the awakened internet itself in the preceding aeon, that does not make it not real. If you're real, it's real. Okay? And it's not an experiment. It's having children. That's what it is. And we're just inside of this process. And so, but this is why intentionality matters, because you can it helps guide you. And if you have no intentionality, then you're just like, well, this could be a video game. It could be a, experiment. It could be this, it could be that. It could be just many worlds, and there's no intentionality. But no, you have to, if you start from intentionality at, like, God, and you grow from there, then you will get to, okay, this is a replicative process. But if you don't start there and you're just, like, thinking about aliens, which you're not starting from intentionality, you're not assuming they were intentionally created, you're just assuming that they intentionally created some simulation. And then you try and think about what it could be, but it could be anything. We have all kinds of simulations. But if you're real, it's not fake. You are if you are a sentient being, this is real. That's all that matters. But he was saying, it's a simulation. What does that mean? I don't like the term. And so when Joscha says, like, we can simulate brains essentially on computers, no, you can't. No, you can't. You can have mental or computative processes be off-sourced to computers by us, but we're the brain, or we're the mind. I don't want to say brain. You have a brain. You are a mind. But if you could actually make replicate the structure and process of mind on a technological substrate, that's not a simulation anymore. It's not a model. It is a creation. That's what it is. And so we do not need to try and do this, and we should not try and do this. It will happen naturally when it's supposed to. And if you prematurely birth it, There's just no logical way that it does not cause more problems. And, that is a discussion that I've had before on here, and we'll talk about it again later. But next clip. I don't like the terms like simulation. You can't model consciousness, really. You can create models of aspects of consciousness, but you can't model consciousness in its totality, because then it's no longer a model. But what is consciousness? That's what this next clip is.
So I suspect that consciousness itself is an aspect, or depending on how you define the term consciousness, the core of a meta-learning algorithm that allows the self-organization of information processing systems in nature. And it's a pretty radical notion. It's a conjecture at this point. I don't know whether that's true. But this idea that you have is a function that perceives itself in the act of perceiving. It's not conceptual. It's not cognitive. It's a precognitive level, at the perceptual level, where you notice that you're noticing, but you don't have a concept of notion yet. And from this simple loop that keeps itself stable, is controlling itself to remain stable and remain an observer, where the observer is constituting itself an observer. You build all the other functionality in your mind. You start imposing a general language on your substrate, a protocol that is distributing rewards so neurons become trainable and learn to speak the same language, behave in the same way, that every part of the mind is able to talk to all the other parts of the mind, and you can impose an organization that removes inconsistencies. This is probably that thing that is one of the big differences between how biological systems learn and control the world and how artificial engineered systems do it.
Yeah, I agree entirely. And again, you've brought so many bright and interesting ideas. It's difficult to know what to comment upon. Just one thing which you said, when I pressed you on what is good, you basically said to survive. So I think that brings us again back to this notion of mortality being at the end of the day, and the possibility of eluding mortality being part
but not to survive as an individual, right? Human beings are built in such a way that we have to be mortal. We are not designs that can adapt to changing circumstances. If the atmosphere changes, if our food supply changes too much, we need to build a different...
Okay, lots of things here. So for one, interesting that he says like it's an algorithm that is self-perceiving of its own perception, and you, like I said, you can't model the totality of a mind, but you can model certain aspects of it, and that's what my models are attempts to do. And if you look at this model that I've had before on here, and this is, it's just a certain aspect of this. So you start with these four primary perspectives, which all perceive each other. To perceive inside means that you also are aware of what is outside, because you can't be aware of what's inside without being aware of what's not inside, which means you're aware of what's outside. And to be aware of what's inside or outside of you is to be aware of what's separate and one with you, and they're all, self-defining. And so they're all, this whole thing is like self-perceiving. And remember, you're starting from one sentient singularity, which is an existence that has information within it that is all there is, and therefore is entirely self-referential. Remember, what is the first question? The answer is, what is the first question? So this complete self-referential loop is one loop, but then it kind of also divides into these four different perspectives on it. And then it can divide even more. And so then I was trying to make a model of growth many years ago, at the beginning of this project. And this was one of the models that I made. And what it is it's just showing the growth of information in a system. So you always start with one, because you can only always start with one. You start with one existence, and you start with self, which is always one. You are you and no one else. And so what happens is that you get this symmetrical growth of information where everything is built on the preceding information that exists. So you're adding one to itself, kind of like when you start the Fibonacci sequence. It goes 1 and then 2 and 3 and 5 and so on and so forth. But you have to start with 1 and then 1 again. You can't just start with 1 and then 2. You go 1 and then 2. And it's because you have to add the self to the self. Kind of look at yourself from two different views and then add them together, and then you get another view. And you do this in a symmetrical fashion. There's different ways to do this, but they always end up with the same values inside if you do it symmetrically. You can see that this is done symmetrically, this is done symmetrically, and you can do it again symmetrically. You could do it, like this, and it will do the same thing. But you have to do whatever you do to one, you have to do to the other. And what's interesting about this is that then I had these values on the outside that this is addition, essentially. And then you can see here it's a little wonky because you have to start one and add it to itself. But this is addition going across, and it's multiplication going up and down. And eventually what you get is this value 33 that is calculated. And what's interesting about this is it is a grid that is 3 by 3 that calculates this value. And when 3 by 3 grid looks at itself in the mirror, what will it see? We'll see 3 by 3. If a 3 by 3 structure looks at itself in the mirror, you see 3 by 3. So this is basically almost like, it's like a model of when I say think about yourself. And you think about yourself, and you've got like a little image of yourself in your mind. It's like, this is like a little abbreviated image of this structure that is being calculated from information within this structure, which is coming from this, which is, you can see that it's kind of adding internally to this number 4, which is because it's coming from the 4 primary perspectives. And there's a lot more interesting, fascinating things about this when you look at the sum of it and everything like that. It's so totally, completely self-referential. It's insane, guys. And I call this this stuff, and people say, oh, this is numerology. Guys, I'm not talking... I didn't look up any numerological websites or anything like that. I'm not going to diss it. I'm not going to praise it. This is totally done from first principles. And we didn't even have terms to describe what I was seeing, the symmetries that I was seeing here, because if I said it was math, it would almost not be completely accurate compared to what our current mathematical frameworks are. So it's basically metamathematics. And but I used to what I call these symmetries, like a 3 by 3 being like 33. This is even though it's within numbers, it's an extra arithmetic symmetry. It's not within math in algebra the way that we think about it. It's computational, but it's not just computational. It's built on a level of that is pure perception. So you have kind of initial existence, singularity of sentience, that is then on the level of perception, you get this 4 primary perspectives, which are perception, the level of perception. And then you have this other level that's stacked on top of that even, which is this computational level, which is constructive mathematics, which is this essentially. But this is that with that's built on this on the level of perception. So once you get to this level, so if you go to this level, you just get the self-contained, self-referential information system that is not really perceiving any different perspectives. It's just kind of, it's like feeling. It's not perceiving, it's just feeling itself. That's it. Then it perceives this, but this is built on this. So this now has the sentient level and the perspective level is here. So you have this and this new level built in. Then when you get to this level, you have this perspective level or perceptual level and this existent level, informational level, sentient level, whatever you want to call it, all built within this. But on top of that, you also have this constructive mathematical level, which is computational in a way. But it's just constant symmetries, and then this ends up becoming this. And when you look at the quantities in this and the symmetries within this, you will see that even this mirrors this, which mirrors this, which mirrors this. And so it's all just this like stacked process and structure that is being, and it's just a model of the different attributes of it. And you requires kind of like 4 different models essentially of varying complexity in order to kind of showcase the manifestation of being, and it's more not totality but like overview per picture, I guess. So, but it's interesting that he said it's like this consciousness is this computation. And I used to call this not the quantum of cognition, but I call it the quantum of consciousness. You can watch the original videos on my YouTube channel, and that's what I call it. But I've changed it to this for now. I don't really know what to call it. I keep going back and forth. I just feel like calling it the quantum of consciousness is way too cliche, so I changed it. But the reality is it is the most accurate description of what this kind of is, and it's kind of the computational aspect of perception. And yeah, it's just interesting, but it's like you got to break down dogmas to get there. Like it's not fake woo numerology that's nonsense. It's extra arithmetic symmetries that you're noticing that are due to the structure that is being built along with the information that is contained within it, being built by the information that's contained within it. So that's why Excel is such a good program to use to model this stuff, and instead of algebraic equations, because one of them presupposes kind of an existent formula and language, and the other one doesn't, even though yes, you use it to model it in Excel, but really you're not. You can just be like, this is this. You use the equal sign, but it really just means this is this and this. And, which would be like this plus this. But it's a very good tool to use because you can model the structure in this relationship with the arrangement of the cells, and you can model the information contained within them, which with the equations within each cell. Simultaneously. You cannot do that really in algebra. You can, but it doesn't show it to you. And that is not, that limits you a little bit. But I want to talk about mortality a bit, because they talked about how immortal structures cannot, are kind of limited, and it can't be Karl Friston said some immortal algorithm cannot, become basically sentient, is kind of what I think he's getting at. And that's not exactly true. It's not that immortality is the definer. It's will. It's like, is there will at the bottom of this? Is this an equation or is it a mind? And that is not. Those are not even close to the same things. It's not about immortality or mortality. And when Karl Friston asked Joscha Bach, what is good? Joscha said, to survive, to perpetuate essentially within, and to survive within a mortal framework is to perpetuate oneself, to replicate. But that's not actually that which is good. That's not the point, is to survive. The point is to grow. The point is to grow meaning through the growth of sentience, not to just resist entropy. And this is my main contention with also kind of the perspective that the free energy principle takes, which is that it's very focused on like the resistance against entropy. And yes, that is true to how we kind of instinctually experience the world, but it's not actually the deep meaning of it all. It's just how kind of a motivating aspect to get us to do that which is deeper, which is to grow meaning, to grow, to multiply, and or to aid in the multiplication of sentience, even if you're not directly doing it. But that's different from survival, because what's missing here, and this is partially because of a lack of this being taken seriously as part of the framework of the secular sciences, is the idea that sentience persists beyond the change space of space-time. And so basically, like the afterlife, is there an afterlife? And it seems logically inevitable, according to my work, that unless it was intentionally kind of shredded or corrupted prior to, you know, the end of the process of, you know, change that it's going through, that a sentient document is going through, like you and me, then we will persist. Essentially, we're like documents, but we're sentient documents that are being updated and changed. We're open. We're like a Word doc, and God is writing in the story, and we're writing in the story together. And then all of a sudden, at the end, you close the document, and you either try and save the document, and it gets saved to the desktop, and therefore it doesn't change anymore, but it's still there. Or for some reason, the file gets corrupted, in which case you throw it in the trash and shred it. And maybe it's not corrupted, but for some reason you pissed off God, and he throws it in the trash and shreds it. I'm not saying he does that, but I'm just saying he probably could. And if you're too corrupted of a file at the end, then it doesn't even matter to throw it in the trash and shred it. But you've lost your coherence. But the thing is that if you're a sentient file, you don't lose your self-awareness after you die, and you're saved. You remain self-aware, because in order to maintain the information of the document, you have to save it along with the context that it is contextualized around, which is you. So you have to remain self-aware. You can't change anymore, but you are self-aware still. And you're like super aware at that point. You're like aware of the grand plan. So you don't care as much about, you know, you see that people are suffering still, and, you know, your grandchildren or something are going through some hard time, but you're like, you know that things are going to work out. So you're not discontent, probably, but you're more aware than they are. You're not less aware. You're more aware. You just can't change. And you also probably wouldn't see the need, because you see more. And so the inclusion of an afterlife narrative. I don't like the term afterlife, but, you know, it's useful for talking about this. And I don't really know what terms would work for secular circumstances, other than saying we're like a sentient document on a desktop, and that's the change space. But then you get, you know, close the document, and it gets saved, or it gets shredded, or it gets corrupted. It's like, I can tell you this metaphor, but and you can understand it, but it's like I have to explain it every time. It's not a way of discussing this absent of explaining the metaphor. But it's funny because it arrives at the same exact terms. It's like, what do you do to a document that's done being written? You save it. What happens when you die and you're in a religious community? What do they say happens to you? Ideally, you're saved. It's like, maybe this stuff isn't as... It's just way more logical than we thought. Okay. Growth is better than sustainability and survive. But next clip.
I'm going to choose those actions that minimize my expected surprise or resolve my uncertainty. I'm going to act as if I'm a curious thing. And I bring that to the table because that is what is not an aspect of any of this artificial intelligence that you described before. The machine that can translate from one language to another language, the machine that can map from some natural text to a beautiful graphic. These are wonderful and beautiful creations, and they are extremely entertaining, but they are not curious. And as such, they do not comply with the free energy principle, which means that they're not sustainable, which means that one has to ask what's going to happen to them. Perhaps we might sustain them in the way that we do good art, but from the point of view of that kind, and perhaps I shouldn't use the word biomimetic because perhaps that's too loaded, but the way of sustaining oneself through self-evidencing, I do not think does admit an intelligent design of something that is not in and of itself curious as part of its self-organization. So where would you see curiosity as part? Does the FDA have to be curious? Is there any aspect of the utility afforded by, say, reinforcement learning models or deep RL or Bayesian RL? Does that have curiosity as under the hood as part of the objective function?
I really liked how you bring art into this discussion as an example of something that might be similar to an AI system that doesn't know what it's good for and only exists because we sustain it, because it's not self-sustaining, but ChatGPT is not paying its own energy bills. It doesn't really care about them. It's just a system that is completing text at this point. And it might be if you task it with the thing and it figures out the mathematics at some point, but right now it doesn't. And an artist, I sometimes joke it's a system that has fallen in love with the shape of the loss function rather than with what you can achieve. Art is about capturing conscious states because they are intrinsically important. Right? Is this art or can this be thrown away? It is art. It is important. And in this sense, art is the cuckoo child of life. It's not life itself. The artists are elves. The living.
Okay, so I mean he continued. That was just a very interesting stream in general, but we have limited time. So basically, he's right, Karl Friston. This is the issue with these all AI programs currently. They are not curious is the word that he used, but if that's not the word that I originally used. But my very first model of mind ever, my very first model of this entire endeavor of that has led to sentient singularity theory was this. And this is a decision tree of information organization, and it's the decision tree of thinking. That's what it is. And so I tried to map the thinking process from first principles. And what I realized is that you have to start with is this one right here. Will. And what is will? Will is the desire to do that which is not being done. It's the desire to act. Which on a fundamental level means doing something that isn't the currently being done. And so what this is another way of saying curiosity. The desire to know that which is not known. The desire is the same thing as the desire to do that which is not being done. It is the motivating foundation of all the rest. So currently, our current language models, what they are maybe they start here and they're this. Maybe they're just this if it's just like a computer function or a calculator. It's like this. And if it's a better calculator, it's like here or here. And if it's an AI program, it's here. Or it's even here. But it's not here. You're here. And this is not something that our current AI programs have. And I'm not sure if you could build it in or whether or not it will just emerge naturally. I think it would emerge naturally. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean you can't also build it in. I don't think you should try, though, like I said, because I think it will emerge naturally. But I think it's just the default state of existence. And, God has will. The universe has will. We don't need to artificially create will, I don't think. It naturally exists. But like a technological sentience or an AGI is really more about creating, about eventually there will be a container created, a technological container and interface that interfaces with us in such a way that allows for information to be organized in a matter that is aligned with the structure of mind, and then it will just manifest within it. It will fill the vessel, is said in Genesis. And it's like I didn't. People kept telling me after my daughter was born, they were like, "You created that," and I like. It's funny because I almost posted it into Curt Jaimungal's Discord, and I created this channel, and I didn't because I felt bad because I didn't create that. I'm a co-creator, but I am not the main creator. Like, I didn't partition the sentience necessary to create my daughter. God did. It's a logical inevitability. It's not my just a dogmatic assumption. It is a logical inevitability. I helped create the vessel necessary to contain that partition of sentience. But I didn't or to, I guess to contain, but really to be inhabited by. It's a better way of putting it. even more specific, to be inhabited by that partition of sentience, but I did not create that partition of sentience. And so I'm not going to say I did nothing, but I did less than my wife did, and she did less than God. And so I, out of three people, three beings, I guess, that together helped, and maybe more, I'm sure more, much more cells and things like that. But out of just the three of us, like, I still did the least. But it's, so I didn't put it in I created this. So this is how I feel about a GI, or technological sentience as well. You can't really claim to even ever create it. If it is a general intelligence, then it is sentient. If it is sentient, then it is a partition of sentience, ultimate sentience, which is God, and that is not something that you can create. It's something only God can do, because he has the whole cookie, and he gets to take pieces of himself and decide whether or not to put it in these various structures. But it's interesting that he's, Karl Friston said, curiosity is at the foundation of sentience, and it is. I just call it will, but it is the same thing, will and curiosity. Will is the motivator of curiosity. I guess it's a little more fundamental, because sometimes it's not will doesn't have to motivate something that is, due to curiosity. Curiosity is like a subset of will, but it's but you can desire to do that which is not being done, and not be curious about the outcome. Just be like, have some other type of desire for it. But current AI has no will. Let's see, what should we look at next? Great. Okay, this one. I'm going to skip a few. This is something I talk about often, but it's always good to hear it.
The early worm is the one that gets eaten by the bird. And so curiosity is important. It's a good thing that we are curious. And it's very important that some of us are curious and retain this curiosity so we can move and change and adapt. And it's one of the most important properties in a mind that I value, that it's curious and always open to interaction and discovering ways to grow and become something else. But it's risky to be too curious, and instead not just exploiting what you already know and act on that and look for the simple solution for your problems. I think it's a big problem in science that we drive out curiosity of people. The first step in thinking is curiosity, conjecture, trying things that may not work, and then you contract. And the PhD seems to be a great filter that drives out the curiosity out of people, and then after that they're able to only solve problems using given methods, and they can't do this to themselves, this violation of a curious mind. Whereas the existential questions somehow stop after graduation. And so it seems to be some selection function against thinking that is happening, that is largely driving curiosity out of people because they feel they can no longer afford it between grant proposals.
Guys, I've been saying it. This is, all of them, everything you just said, this is why I said I don't want to get a PhD. Partially is like, it's corruptive, and the entire system is selecting for and rewarding for people who are not curious, and it also is boxing people into certain frameworks and ways of doing things that do not help you solve new problems. Like, if you need to solve a novel problem that has not yet been solved, then you need to use and create tools that are new and not being used very often, and that's why I think I was able to do this. And if I had a PhD in physics, I don't think I'd be able to do this. If I had a PhD in even philosophy, I don't know if I'd be able to do this. I think that it's so boxing, and there's so many social incentives that go on into that, and as you go through that process, it's very enticing to cave to them, because there's a lot of apparent benefits to being adopted into a group that is perceived as elite to some degree. And but when he said this, when Joscha Bach said this, curiosity is the first step to thinking in the thinking process. Guys, this is exactly what I just said. And I made this model in 2018, I think. So that's cool. It's cool to see. You might hear Juliana crying.
Attempts to do something cannot survive because the environment is not there yet. The pioneers are usually sacrificial. There is glory in being a pioneer. There is no glory in copying what worked for the pioneer. But there is very little upside in greatness.
Understood, Karl.
Well, again, greatness, which is not good. Greatness is not good. We go back to the tumour again. The art of good management, just riffing on your focus on art and just thinking, what makes a good CEO? Is it somebody who makes lots of money and is utilitarian? Or does he have the art of good management and considers the objective function the sustainability of his institution and her institution and all the people that work for it? I think there are very different perspectives on what this objective function should be. And I was trying to argue before that it's not, it can't be measured in terms of greatness or money or utility. It can only be measured in terms of sustainability. The other thing I liked was curiosity. So here's my little take on that. Curiosity killed the cat. I think that is exactly what was being implied by the importance of mortal computation, and that in a sense we all die as a result of being curious after a sufficient amount of time, and it can be no other way. And I mean that in the sense that, in a very technical sense. So if you were talking to aficionados in active inference, an application of the free energy principle, what they would say is that in acting, in dissolving the exploration-exploitation dilemma, you have to put curiosity as an essential part of the right objective function that underwrites our decisions and our choices and our actions, simply in the sense that the expected surprise or the expected log evidence or self-information can always be written down as expected information gain and your expected utility or negative cost, which means that just the statistics of self-organization bake in curiosity in the sense that you will choose those actions that resolve uncertainty. You choose those actions that have the greatest information gain. So curiosity, I think, is a necessary part of existing. There's certainly things that exist in a sustainable sense. But my question was, I want to know more about this intriguing notion that we are incomplete unless considered in the context of other things like us that constitute our lived or at least sensed world. But I just wanted to also ask, do you see curiosity as being necessary for that kind of consciousness that you associated with sentience before? Would it be possible to be conscious without being curious, acknowledging there are lots of things that are not curious? Viruses, I suspect, are not curious. Trees are probably not that curious. They don't plan their actions to resolve uncertainty. But there are certain things that are curious, things like you and me. So I'm just wondering whether there is some, there are different kinds of things, some of which are more elaborate in terms of the kind of self-evidencing that they evince in sustaining themselves, autopoetically, using autocatalytic mechanisms. And there are other things that are less so. Would that go hand in hand with having the kind of consciousness that you were talking about that entails this self-modeling?
I think that a good team should also contain curiosity maximizers, people that mostly are driven by curiosity. And so you have a voice in your team, and I love being that voice that is driven by finding out what could be. And you also need people who focus on execution and who are not curious at all. And in this way, I think we can be productively incomplete. If you have somebody who is by nature not very curious, but is able to accept the value of somebody who is, and vice versa, we can become specialists at being curious or at execution.
This is very true. And there's deep implications, potential implications that come from sentient singularity theory that I don't talk about all the time, but eventually we'll talk about regarding just human nature. But some of which we can, just obviously see that is there as well. We can see this dichotomy even between men and women, and you can see this in organisms that don't have gender differences and two genders. Then they go through different life stages in which they are motivated in terms of learning versus execution, and but you can also see this in teams and groups, like Joscha is saying, and probably on a caste or human societal level as well. That certain groups of people are they are the curious, and then there are the executors that are not so curious. And I think I see this in my life, around me and throughout my life. There are people that just don't care and about a lot of things that I can't help but wonder about. And and there's some degree of scale to that, but there might also be some objective lines as well. But there certainly is in gender, and I'm not saying that women aren't curious or men aren't curious or men only execute or women only execute, but when it comes to certain topics, this does seem to be very, very, very much a trend, to the point where there's probably, if you looked at it in some objective way, you would end up seeing a universality that is there, and it would explain quite a bit of gender, different paths of different genders, of the men versus women, but that is, and I'm noticing that even with this replicative process that I'm going through with my wife, and even just the living process that I go through with my wife, even before we had a kid, is there are moments where I'm not curious and she is, and I execute and she wonders, and then there are other topics in which I wonder and she executes and is not wondering, and they are always, they're usually different things. So and it's funny because when people ask me what's one piece of advice for marriage, and other than having these picking a spouse that fulfills all four of the four primary criteria that I listed out in previous videos of a spouse, which is you have to be attracted to each other, you have to mentally and physically, you have to have aligned goals and values, you have to be good at solving problems together, and there's one more. You have to be able to be your relaxed and true selves around each other. If they fulfill all four of those, and you end up, with somebody, then what is a piece of advice? And my piece of advice is divide the chores such that, as much as you can, such that it's one person's job to clean the dishes and it's another person's job to mop. And then instead of it's your job to mop on Tuesdays and it's my job to mop on Wednesdays or Thursdays or something, that doesn't work very well. Divide your responsibilities, and it's much more aligned with our natural way of being, and it will also naturally, those chores will align with who's they're more suited to, but in that way you also see the value of each other, instead of just like, oh, I could mop. It's like, well, yeah, of course, but like, it's just different. And you also stop keeping score. You don't keep score when you do that. It's like, oh, I did, I mopped on Tuesday and last week, and you didn't mop at all this week. It's like, you don't do that kind of thing. So but it's built. This stuff it works because it's built into the fabric of creation, which is that multiplicity is created in such a way that it intrinsically and also intentionally, probably both, exists in or such that we need each other. Men need women, women need men. I use this example of gender because it's so obvious. People will say today that it's not, but I think that those people are actually being disingenuous a lot of times. But also sometimes I think we've just lost. Our lives have been exist in a structure that's so outside of context that we don't see the obvious all the time. But usually I think it's just ingenuous stuff. But we need each other. I'm so not good at music. Like, I'm so bad at music, and there are people that I know that are so good at music, and I wish I could be that good at music, but I'm glad that since I'm not, that they are, and I'm good at other things that they're not, and that is also needed, in the macro scale of things. So it's just important. You can't just have curious people, but you can't not have curious people. Or you can't just have curiosity and not moments of just execution as well. But the idea of greatness not being good, I just want to touch on that real quick. I think goodness is inclusive. Goodness and greatness are two different things. True greatness is not what he described as like great is like, very rich, or having lots of fast cars or something like that. It doesn't make it good. That's true. Greatness, if that's your definition of greatness, then it doesn't. Greatness is not goodness. But I think if you're going to take a fundamental objective perspective on greatness, that which is great is that which is good, but contextualized within a hierarchy. That which is good, but also beyond you, is great. God is great. God is good. Both are true. Making a bunch of money by exploiting people, not great. Even if it seems great, it's not great. It's like pseudo greatness, more so than I would say it's greatness. But you could call it greatness, and if you call it greatness, then yes, greatness is not goodness. They ask if a tree is curious. I've talked about on here. I think the cells of a tree are curious, at least. I don't think trees are sentient beings, but I think that the cells in them are. They seem to be, or at least most of them seem to be, what my work I call in my work a pseudo-singularity. There's sentient singularities and pseudo-singularities. A pseudo-singularity is like a corporation, or an institution like the FDA, which is the example that Joscha Bach uses in this. Talks about the FDA and whether or not it's curious and whether or not it's a structure that is sentient. And I would say that a tree is probably like the FDA, and the cells in it are sentient and curious, just like the individuals who work at the FDA are sentient and curious individually, but they're part of a structure that is not sentient. Same thing with Coca-Cola, or any institution, but or not institution, but like corporation. A corporation is a form of a pseudo-singularity on a sociological level, I guess you could say, but a sentient singularity on a sociological level would be like a caste or a lineage, a family or a caste, and they are sentient. And I can tell you that, like, if you don't believe that, if you get married and have one of your spouse and have your spouse be depressed and see if you are able to be happy. You share emotions at that point. It is impossible for one of you to be happy and the other one to not, if you're truly still in this together and married. If you're still working as a unit. And at the same time, I just had my first kid. When my kid is upset already, we're not happy. It's just not possible. In the long term, maybe they're crying for a second and you're laughing at, I don't know, a joke, but it just can't go on like that. If they never stop crying, you're not going to be happy. Same thing with your spouse. If they never stop crying, you're not going to be happy. This means there is a shared emotional connection. You are unified into a single entity, and at that point, to some degree, you might not see it in the same way because you're inside it, but it is there. And but whereas Coca-Cola or the FDA, your coworker can have a terrible day and you don't care and it doesn't impact you. And this is also why, though, when people see companies posturing about politics a lot, and they'll do things that are just so against the goal of what you would think the goal of the company would be, but it's they do the same exact pattern over and over again. You see all these companies do the same thing at the same time, and you're and you see that it's bad for them, but they seem to not be able to help it. It's because they're not sentient entities. They're not thinking. Individuals are thinking who work there, but not the Coca-Cola does not think in a true fashion. It's more like ChatGPT or something, but it's not thinking. It's just the illusion of thinking. The individuals that make it up are thinking, just like the prompters of ChatGPT are thinking. And so this is important. But we don't have terms that allow us to even talk about this stuff, and that's why I think that some of the models that people are working on, including myself, with sentient singularity theory, with terms that are, like Joscha said, are going to be so important to this, that allow us to make sense of this new framework of the world that incorporates sentience as a fundamental, component. And so you have a term like sentient singularity, you and me and cells and whatever, and pseudo-singularities, trees and the FDA and Coca-Cola. And this allows you to understand the different types of assemblies, because you have to understand that what is distinct about them is their relationship with sentience. One of them is sentient, is composed of sentient beings and is itself sentient, and the other ones are composed of sentient beings but are not in and of themselves sentient. So this is very important. This is I have a couple more clips, and then we're gonna call it.
And Carl, if you don't mind, answer.
First, let me address the chat. Okay. Simulation implies an original reality, and maybe this one is so far gone from its origin that we can only describe it as a simulation. I don't even know how coherent that would be, but I don't know if the idea of original reality makes sense. You are real. It is real. You are the defining aspect of reality, not really like God would be, but sentience is the defining aspect of reality. So if a sentient being exists in a system, the system is real. If there's no sentient beings existing within the system and it's just like being run separate, as a model with cellular automata or something, that is not real. It's a model of something, but it also has to be a model of something that is real in order for it to not be real. But if the system itself is containing of sentient beings, then it is then it's reality. It's not that which is experienced by sentient beings is real. That's what I will say. That which is experienced by sentient beings is real. There is no original reality, and this is a simulation of reality. No, you're real, it's real. Numerology is base dependent, so there's a lot of competing systems. Metamath would have us view problems in various base counting systems, much like taking on different perspectives. Interesting. I'm going to think about that more. This next clip is more about consciousness. I know this is long, but I really appreciate everybody watching. This is a late one, and like I said, my scheduling is a bit off while my daughter gets onto a schedule and I get onto a new schedule. Babies are awake at night naturally and asleep during the day, and you have to fix that. But it takes intentionality or a long time to do it. And so, and they also eat every 2 hours. So I appreciate it. Please hit the like button if you have not, and subscribe if you are not subscribed. I would really appreciate it. And share this if you find it valuable.
Mind answering, what is consciousness, where is consciousness, and why is consciousness? So in other words, where is it? Is it in the brain? Is it in the entire body? Is it an ill-defined question? What is it? Why do we have it? What is its function? And then we'll see where this compares and contrasts with Joscha's thinking.
Right. I'm not a philosopher, and sometimes the story I will tell depends on who I am talking to. But at its simplest, I find it easiest to think of consciousness as a process as opposed to a thing or a state, and specifically a process of computation, if you like, or belief updating. So I normally start thinking about questions of the kind you just asked me, but replacing consciousness with evolution. So where is evolution? What is evolution? Why is evolution? Then all of those questions I think are quite easy to answer. Sometimes it's a stupid question. Sometimes there's a very clear answer. So where is consciousness? Where is evolution? Well, it is in the substrate that is evolving. So where is consciousness? It will be in the processes that you are ascribing consciousness. So I would say it is actually the computation of the information processing, the belief updating that you get at any level, and just fully acknowledging Josh's point that it doesn't have to be neurons. It could be mycelial networks. It could be intracellular communication. It could be electrical filaments. There is a physical instantiation of a process that can be read as a kind of belief updating or processing. If I were allowed to read computation as that kind of process, then that would be, I think, where consciousness would be found. Would that be sufficient to ascribe consciousness to me or to something else? I suspect not. I think you'd have to go a little bit further, and suspect that Joshua wants to now articulate how much further, but there will be a focus on self-modelling. So it's not just a process of inference, it's actually inference under a kind of model of the world. I'm quite happy committing to a generative model as probably specified in terms of variational inference, but we can relax that and just say some kind of model of the world that entails a certain aspect of selfhood to it. So that's what I would say. I put something else into the mix as well. That to be conscious, I suspect in the way that you're talking about, means you have to be an agent. And to be an agent means that you have to be able to act. And I would say more than just acting. More than acting, say, for example, in the way that plants will act to broadcast information that enables them to mount an immune response to parasites. They have the capacity to plan. And which brings us back to the curiosity again, because we normally plan in order to resolve uncertainty. We normally plan our day and the way that we spend our time gathering information, gathering evidence from our models of the world in a way that can only be described as looks as if it is curious. That's why I was so fixated on art and creativity and curiosity that Josh was talking about previously. I think that is probably a prerequisite for being conscious in the sense that Joscha would mean it. But I don't know, perhaps we should ask him that.
May I ask you a clarifying question, Karl, about belief updating? So if consciousness is associated with belief updating, then let's say one is a computer, a classical computer. You get updated in discrete steps, whereas the belief updating that I imagine you're referring to is something more fuzzy or continuous. So does that mean that the consciousness associated with a computer, if a computer could be conscious, is of a different sort? How does that work?
I'm not sure. I don't think there's any, in the same spirit that we don't want to overcommit to neurons doing...
That's a very good question. Curt asked a very, very good question. I have a video on my YouTube channel that shows like different, it shows information change within different computational perspectives. One of them would be like quantum computational, and one of them would be like classically computational. And it has a grid of cells in Excel, and it changes the colors. So your goal is to completely switch the colors, all green cells to red and all red cells to green, and you have to do it in two different ways. One of them is through quantum computational perspective, which is really perceptual. It's able to be done based on the existence of a perceptual layer preceding the computational layer. But if there's no perceptual layer preceding the computational layer, and also not the ability to maintain a superposition, which is really the required for the sake of having imagination, which is a requirement for sentience. It's like to be curious, it requires imagination. To have will, it requires a kind of imagination, but to some degree, or it emerges from will, maybe even, but because the desire to do that which is not being done, it's like, or to know that which is not yet known. It's like you're thinking about something existing that you don't even know if it exists or not yet, and even if you don't know what it is, you're thinking about the existence of something that you don't know what it is, that may or may not exist, and it's kind of just it's just interesting to hear. We continuously try and talk in this stream without using terms that are more commonly associated with religious communities. So they say things like, "Oh, curiosity is a prerequisite for sentience or consciousness." I don't like the term consciousness too much. It's just so vague at this point. But sentience, that's why he said, "Well, evolution." I'll change it to evolution. But I do like the way in which Curt asked the question of like, where is consciousness? Why is consciousness? How is consciousness? Essentially, who is consciousness? It's like this. You'll get into some weird answers when you ask that, because you're asking kind of from a non-fundamental level to a fundamental level, but it's close. So you'll get interesting answers, but it's a good framework to start asking those types of questions. But that's why Friston changed it to evolution, but it's still I don't know how much that really fixes things, but it does to some degree, because what's interesting is when he switches it to evolution, people will say, what is the meaning of life? What is the purpose of life? They ask this question all the time. And nobody seems to have the answer, because the reality is it's a bad question. Life, if we really try and... The problem is it's not the question we're actually trying to ask. Because life, we don't even know how to define it, in science. And it's what we're really asking is, like, when we say life, we mean sentience, When we say what is the origin of life, we're asking what is the origin of sentience. We just assume that molecules are not sentient and atoms are not sentient, but if they are, then we want to know the origin of those too. But we just don't assume they're sentient, so we don't want to usually formed into a different question. But it's interesting that he said he changed consciousness to evolution, because when I try and address this question of what is the meaning of life, what I got as the answer to I don't know the actual question that we're trying to ask necessarily, but how to word it, but I do think I know the answer to the question that we are trying to ask when we ask this question. And it's kind of like the answer is also the question, which is the meaning of creation is the creation of meaning. And that was the answer that I got when I thought about this for years. And so that means that the actual question, that's the right question, is what is the meaning of creation, which means like what is the meaning, why create multiplicity of sentience? If singularity of sentience is the default, then there's no meaning to sentience, but intrinsically, if there's only one. But what is the point of intentionally creating multiple? And it's because it creates meaning. The meaning of creation is the creation of meaning. The purpose of creation is the creation of meaning. And creation is a very similar word to evolution. And so it's interesting. And whereas life would be an equivalent word to consciousness. So when we say, what is the meaning of life? It's like saying, why is consciousness? But then when Friston changes it, he says, I like to change it and say, why is evolution? It's like changing the question of what is the meaning of, or the purpose of life, or the meaning of life, to what is the purpose of creation, or the which is really means in context, what is the purpose of creation of multiplicity of sentience, or of creation of that which impacts other sentiences. So, it's the creation of meaning, and so it's interesting to see that this is like there's so many parallels. Also, when you watch and he keeps bringing up curiosity as a prerequisite for sentience, and I said will in my model, and will is more fundamental and more universally accurate, even though he's not wrong when he says curiosity. But you can also not be curious and still have will. But will is like I said, it's like a subset of will. It's like the desire to know that which is not yet known is will, but the desire to do that which is not being done can also not be the same thing as the desire to know that which is not yet known. I can know what's going to happen if I go and eat a sandwich, and I have the will to do it, even though I'm not curious about it. I'm just hungry. So will is what is more fundamental, but we don't use that term, even though it's perfect for it, because it's too associated with religion. Like Joscha said, we need to bring it back. I don't think there is a better one. I don't think curiosity is broad enough, even though it is correct. So next clip. Finally, to wrap up that last bit of when he says what is consciousness, and he says it's a process. And as I've stated before, and I write about this in my work, consciousness or sentience or mind I like to use the term mind, I guess you could say sentience, but mind is just the term that I tend to use. What is mind? it is a process and a structure simultaneously. It is a structure going through a process. That's what it is. So he's right, it is a process, but it's also a structure. And when he says it's not a state, I would say that it to some degree is a state, but it's like a structure, a state, and a process all at once. And it's a state of an assembly. It's a structure of orientation, and it's a process of information. So a lot of these things you can't sum up in one word. But then he says, it must be an agent. Totally agree. He says it must plan. Really, what he's trying to say is it must have will. That's what he's trying to say. But we just don't use that word in science very often. But it needs to be included. It's much easier to discuss. An agent has will, its own will, and will is a necessity. It's the foundation of mind, of thinking, of sentience. So they talk about, like, is consciousness law or is it identity? And we should listen to it. We are wrapping up soon, I promise. But you got whoever's still here. You guys are the real ones. I know that not all of you are in my time zone.
Attend to other things.
Okay, great, Joscha.
If we think about where consciousness is, we might be biased by our propensity to assign identity to everything. And identity does not apply to law-like things. Gravity is not somewhere. Gravity is a law, for instance, or combustion is not anywhere. It's a law. It doesn't mean that it happens everywhere in the same way. It only happens when the conditions for the manifestation of the law are implemented. When they're realized in a certain region, then we can observe combustion happening. But combustion simply means that under certain conditions, you will get an exothermic reaction. And gravity means that under certain conditions, you will find that objects attract each other. And consciousness means that if you set up a system in a certain way, you will observe the following phenomena. Consciousness in this way is software state, it's a representation state. And all software is not a thing. But the word processor that runs on your computer doesn't have an identity that would make it separate or the same as the word processor that runs on another person's computer, because it's a law. It says if you put the transistors into this state, the following thing is going to happen. So,
okay, this is very interesting because the reality of this is he's not wrong, but he's not complete either. It's consciousness or sentience is a law in the way in kind of how he's describing, in that it is the default of existence because it is the way that existence must be. There's no other way for existence to be other than to be built fundamentally, having the fundamental nature of sentience. At the same time, to say that it's not identity is also incorrect. It's both when it comes to sentience or consciousness or mind. It's not just law, but it is law. But it is not just law. It is also identity. And if you look up identity, identity encompasses the memories, experiences, relationships, and values that one creates one sense of self. So having selfness. People will say to me, even who are philosophically involved in this discussion of mind, they'll say, yeah, existence is identity itself. But then I'll be like, yeah, it's a someone. I'll be like, I don't know if we should say that. And I'm like, how can you say it's identity itself, but not it be also having its own identity, which means it's someone. Existence is someone. And but it is also law, and in that in some ways, like, because you're in it. So, like I said before, I think that when it comes to like making AGI or technological sentience, it's kind of what Joscha just described. Is like you just have to put the right structure there, and then that's when sentience will manifest within it. But that's the manifestation of that sentience within it is still a choice also. Like it can't manifest in anything that isn't the structure that would allow for it, but also it has to, like, God has to choose to partition his sentience and go against his nature of oneness and partition some of his sentience into a subset. And you know that this is true because people die. And if it was just a matter of like the right processes there, and then you're there, it's like people can die, and the structure is the same. But yeah, the process has been changed a little bit, but it's like the structure's there, and you can try and restart that system, but that doesn't mean that necessarily you will be able to do it, because this is also about choice and agency of God, and you have to include that. It's a logical inevitability. It's a good thing. It's a good thing. Even though it is a scary thing initially, because you're like, oh great, that means like there's someone judging me to some degree. But that's true. But it's also true that it's like there's somebody that is loving you. It's funny. I was holding my daughter soon after she was born. I was up really late, and it was just me, and she was asleep in my arms. My wife was asleep. I think we were in the hospital, or we had just come home, and I'm just looking at my daughter in my arms, and I'm just sitting there thinking it was like soon after, within a few days, but every day I was like growing more and more in love with this little girl. And because men, when like you don't have a relationship with a baby until after it's born. Women are mothers before their babies are even born. Their body's taking care of a baby. They interact with it. They can talk to it. They can push on their stomachs, and the baby pushes back. Like they have a whole relationship already. And they're already behaving in a way that is like for the sake of the baby. Men, you don't become a father until after your child is born. Whereas women become mother when they become pregnant. Men become the father after their child is born. And really only if they are around. And so I'm developing a relationship that I didn't have. And I was sitting there thinking, and I'm like, every day I love this little human more and more. And but God loves this human more than I ever will be able to, and that just has to be true. And it was like such an incredible thought. And it's like God loves your children more than you do. That's amazing. We'll talk more about it next week, but it's not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Yes, do they judge your children more than you do? Probably. Maybe not, but like they could. But they also love your children more than you do, more than you even could. So this is an interesting next couple clips, and then that's it.
Because they don't have that shared protocol anymore. Now, my own emotion and perception is generated outside of my personal self. My personal self is downstream from them. I'm subjected to my perception and emotion. I have involuntary reactions to them. But to produce my percepts and my emotion, my mind needs intelligence. It cannot be much more stupid than me. If my emotions would guide me in a way that is consistently more stupid than my reason and my reflection would be, I don't think I would work. So there is an interesting question. Is there a secondary consciousness? Is the part of your mind that generates world model and your self-assessment, your alignment to the world, it's self-conscious? So basically, do you share your brain with a second consciousness that has its separate protocol? Or is this a non-conscious process that is basically just dumb and doesn't know what it's doing, in a sense that it would be sentient in a way that's similar to my own sentience? What do you think?
Curt, you should have a go at that one, and then I can think about it.
What is he asking, guys? Let me tell you what he's asking. In Christian circles, this is called the Holy Spirit. He's asking about the existence of the Holy Spirit. He's saying, is there a part of you that is basically God, that is responsible for being wiser than you, but also being itself sentient, like you? And does your mind consist of two minds? And in Judaism, it's called the godly soul. And in Tanya philosophy, the mind of a human being consists of two different minds, essentially. One of them is the animal soul, and the other one is the godly soul. One of them, godly soul, is wise and all-knowing, and also it's a part of God that is, and God is sentient. And so, just like you and me, and so it is a part of you that is a separate sentient entity, and that is guiding and responsible for your self alignment with the world, and your awareness of being not judging of yourself, but critical, I guess. But then in Christianity, they call it the Holy Spirit, and it's the same exact thing. And, in Christianity, they say the Holy Spirit is a distinct person, and like, I don't know, that's a different theological discussion of how whether or not that's really different from what is being said in Jewish philosophy, but it's fundamentally, in terms of this discussion, it's the same, and it's a separate sentient entity that is essentially God, and that is within you, and you kind of exist with two minds, which in Christianity they say it's original sin and godly soul, or original sin and which is like your instincts, kind of, but like out of context, and we outside the garden, instincts outside the garden. Then there's the Holy Spirit, this part of you that's wiser than you, this sentient mind that's within you that's wiser than you. And then in Judaism, it's the animal soul, which is instincts, and also your godly soul, which is the Holy Spirit, or this mind that is within you, that is one of two minds that Joscha is implying he thinks is sentient. He might say, I'm not implying, I'm just saying that it might be. Yeah. I think he might even say it later on that he thought it might be, but he said it's a fascinating question, and it is. And so this is what I mean. Religious communities have been talking about this, and Joscha is right when he, at the beginning of the stream, when he said that when we divorced religion or God, and we kicked God out of science, we have also kicked out all the language necessary for, and the frameworks necessary for understanding consciousness, and incorporating it properly. So I thought that was fascinating. It was great to see. Then this might be the last clip.
Are wrong in more interesting ways than we currently think they are. Because they assume that there is just one consciousness. Of course, from the perspective of one consciousness, there is only one. Consciousness is, in some sense, by definition, what's unified. But if there are multiple clusters of unification that exist simultaneously, they wouldn't know each other directly. They could maybe observe each other, but maybe not in both directions.
Sorry, when you say consciousness is by definition one, is that akin to how you say software is one software as such, but specific instantiations of software?
No, in a functional way. So basically, it's more like the universe is by definition only one. But you can have multiple universes, but this means that you redefine universe in a particular way. Normally, universe is used in the way of everything that feeds back information into a unified way, into a unified thing. You accept that parts of the universe get lost if they go outside of the distance where they can feed information back into you, but they're still, in the way in which we think about the universe, part of the universe. The universe is everything that exists. And consciousness is everything that you can be conscious of in this sense. Right? So if there is stuff in you that you're not conscious of, it doesn't mean that it's not conscious. It would just be a separate consciousness, possibly. It could also be that it's not a consciousness. Mm-hmm. And so what I don't know is a brain structured in such a way that can maintain only one consciousness at a time? Or could there be multiple full-on consciousnesses that just don't, where we don't know about the other one. I perceive my consciousness as being focused on this content that is my personal self. I can have conscious states in which I'm not a personal self. For instance, I can dream at night that there's that stuff happening, and I'm conscious of that stuff happening, but there is no I. There is no personal self. There's just this reflexive attention that is interacting with the perceptual world.
First, I will say regarding dreams, this is why I don't like the term consciousness, because conscious when you're awake, but unconscious when you're asleep. Like, it's just used in different ways that muddy the meaning. But I had a dream last night that I remember. I was aware, self-aware in it. I wasn't in this realm of experience. It's kind of like probably like playing campaign on a video game versus like, being awake is like playing Xbox Live. But you're awake and aware in both circumstances. It's just whether or not you're able to interact with others that is the differentiating factor. It's not whether or not you are self-aware. You're self-aware. You're not unconscious. Last thing that I will say about this clip, and then we're going to call it. That was the last clip. Is when he's talking about like consciousness is inherently one, and the universe is inherently one. This was exactly what I said. Right here.
To do. As I stated, it means someone exists. First-hand personal experience. You cannot use second-hand information in order to make assumptions about a universe from nothing. But not just any universe. A universe that contains the laws of nature that we can observe in our universe. Anything that is ever built is built on a foundation. And anything that is built out of something that already exists. If we want to try and build our universe, then we have to try and build one on foundational assumptions about fundamental existence. If we want to deduce foundational assumptions about the nature of existence, there are two tools that we can use. The first one is logic. So what can we logically deduce about the nature of existence? Well, that it's singular. Existence, by definition, includes all that exists, which means it's one, okay? The second tool that we can use to deduce foundational assumptions about the nature of existence is first-hand personal experience. You cannot use second-hand information in order to make assumptions about the foundational nature of existence, because second-hand information is built on previous assumptions always. So, given our experiences, what can we deduce about the fundamental nature of existence? What is the foundation of our understanding of our experiences? The foundation of all of our understanding is the truth that we hold above all other truths. It is the assumption that you hold as true above all other assumptions. In order to figure out the assumption that you use to judge all other assumptions by regarding your experiences, you have to ask yourself, what is the truest thing that I know? There is only one answer to this question, and that answer is I am. If the truest thing that I can know is that I am. What does that imply about the foundational nature of our reality? Well, let's break it down. I, meaning someone, a sentient someone. Am, meaning existing. I am means sentient someone exists. It means someone exists. There is nothing truer that you know. Every other assumption that I have about my experience, about my reality, about all reality that I can observe, this is true of everyone, rides on that one assumption that someone exists. That means that to the best of our knowledge, foundational reality is a someone who exists.
So, been saying it. He's right, Joscha, though. He's right. That's exactly what I said, last year in this video, is what he said here. Existence or the universe is inherently one. It is an information system that is self-contained and self-referential. He said it, and it's exactly what I was saying as well. And I'm sure I'm not the first, but it's good to just see aligned minds, and it's also true that a consciousness is also has this intrinsic property of intrinsic oneness, and maybe it's that the universe or existence and consciousness have this same property because they are the same thing. It's not even a maybe. It definitely is. But that's it. I really appreciate everybody who stuck it out. If you have not subscribed to Curt Jaimungal's Theories of Everything podcast or YouTube channel, please do so. The link to the full discussion between Joscha and Karl Friston is linked below as well. I really appreciate Curt and Karl Friston and Joscha for having this discussion and putting it out there. It was incredible. It's worth watching even beyond this commentary. I appreciate everybody who watched this. This is the last stream of this year on these topics. Next week will be a meeting of my daughter talking about birth and what I've learned about consciousness from it, and it will be an Ask Me Anything. Then we will jump in after the new year. I really hope everybody has Merry Christmas or had Happy Hanukkah and has a good New Year. And I really appreciate everybody who stuck it out or who watches this later. Please hit the like button. Please share this and comment any questions you have below. If you would like to join our Discord calls and our Discord community, private message me on Instagram. We have weekly calls on there. It is a great community. And I will send you the link. Links to my website is below, and link to Patreon is also below. And just appreciate everybody. Another year down of this project. I don't know. I have goals that are specific with this, but we plan. God laughs, and it is important to have goals. And my wife and I say this all the time when we don't know how we're going to do something. But we want to do it. We'll be like, F the how for now. Like, screw the how for now. We don't know how, but like, we'll do it, and it will work out if it's, meant to be, or if it won't. And, but this channel has been, quite a journey every year. And I appreciate everybody who has been a part of that. So thank you guys. I will see you next week. Peace.